Victor Hale's voice cut across the platform like a whip crack, loud enough to turn every head at the Silver Creek depot. Well, look at this. He stepped forward, thumbs hooked into his vest, a slow grin spreading across his face as he looked Elena Voss up and down her travel-worn dress, her single suitcase, the exhaustion carved into her eyes. Caleb Whitmore sent us up for a mail-order bride, and they shipped him a laundry girl. He let the laughter from his settle before he leaned in, just close enough to make the cruelty feel personal. Honey, the frontier doesn't take charity cases. Turn yourself around while you still can. Elena had been on a train for 4 days. She had not slept properly in 2. Her feet hurt, her back hurt, and she had exactly $11 left in the world. Stood on that platform and looked at Victor Hale and said nothing for a long moment. Not because she had nothing to say, because she was deciding exactly how much of herself she was willing to spend on him. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked past him. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, that you're too old, too tired, too broke, too far from everything you knew, then you already understand what Elena Voss was carrying when she stepped off that train. This story is for you. Stay with us until the end, because what happens in Silver Creek is going to surprise you. And if this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like the video if Elena's already got your attention. She's just getting started. The town of Silver Creek, Wyoming smelled like coal smoke and cattle, and something else Elena couldn't name at first, something dry and permanent, like the land itself had been waiting a long time and had stopped expecting anything good. She had read about frontier towns in newspapers. The descriptions were always one of 2 things, romantic or dire. The romance was for people who'd never been. The dire was closer. But even that missed something: how ordinary the hardship was, how it sat in the faces of people walking the main street like a coat they'd stopped noticing they were wearing. Shifted her suitcase to her other hand and looked down the length of the platform. There was a man standing at the far end, apart from the others who had come to meet the train. He was tall, and he stood with the posture of someone who had spent a long time being used to working alone, shoulders set, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not hostile, not warm. Something more complicated than either. She walked toward him. He did not walk toward her. Told her something. "Mr. Whitmore," she said when she reached him. "Miss Voss." He looked at her suitcase, then at her face. He had gray at his temples and a jaw that hadn't been shaved as recently as she suspected he'd intended. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, not quite brown, not quite green. And they were the eyes of someone who had made a decision recently and wasn't entirely comfortable with it. "You made it." "I did." A pause opened between them, the kind that could have been a conversation, if either of them had been different people. "I should tell you," he said, "that I didn't place that advertisement." "I know," she said. "Your sister wrote to me. She mentioned you might say that." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, resignation, maybe. He picked up her suitcase before she could protest, which surprised her, and turned toward the street. "She also tell you what you're walking into?" "She told me the ranch is struggling." Struggling. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's one word." They walked through Silver Creek in something close to silence. Elena had learned over the years that you could understand a great deal about a place by how people responded to a stranger passing through. In some towns, strangers were curiosities. In some, they were threats. In Silver Creek, she noticed that people looked at her, and then looked at Caleb, and then looked away quickly, deliberately, like they were all privy to something she wasn't. She would learn the shape of that something soon enough. Victor Hale was still on the platform. She could feel him watching her go. She did not turn around. The Whitmore Ranch was 8 miles outside of town, and the ride out told her more than any letter could have. The pasture fences were patched in places not badly, but enough that you could see where the original work had been done well, and where the repair work was done fast, by someone tired and probably alone. The outbuildings needed paint. The well housing had been shored up with lumber that didn't quite match. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was the slow accumulation of a man who had been managing decline rather than building something. Caleb didn't talk much on the drive out. He answered her questions in short, direct sentences. The ranch was 1,200 acres. He ran 230 head of cattle, down from 403 years ago. He had one full-time hand named Doss, who was 61 and had been with the ranch since Caleb's father's time. He had part-time help during branding and during bad winters. What happened 3 years ago? Elena asked. The cattle. He kept his eyes on the road, hard winter, lost some to illness. Lost more when I couldn't move them to the lower pastures in time. He shifted the reins. Made some decisions I wouldn't make now. She noticed that he said it plainly, without embarrassment, but without self-pity either. That was either a sign of a man at peace with his mistakes, or a man so deep in them he'd stopped feeling the weight. She didn't know yet which one Caleb Whitmore was. The house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories, with a wide porch and a stone chimney that suggested it had been built by someone who intended to stay. But there were signs of emptiness everywhere, that a house accumulates when it's been lived in by one person for too long. The second rocker on the porch that had clearly not been moved in a long time. The curtains that were clean, but not recently. Kitchen that had good bones, but the feel of a room where no one really lingered. She set her bag down in the doorway. Your room's upstairs, Caleb said. 3rd door. If you need anything, he stopped, and she could see him renegotiating what he'd been about to say. If there's anything wrong with the room, tell Doss. He knows where things are. Elena looked at him steadily. Mr. Whitmore, I want to ask you something directly. He waited. Are you planning to find a reason in the next week to send me back to St. Louis? The question landed and he didn't flinch from it, which she respected. He looked at the floor of the porch for a moment, then back at her. I'll be honest with you, Miss Voss. I don't know what I'm planning. Margaret sent that letter without telling me. I've spent 3 weeks trying to think of a polite way out of this situation. I haven't found one. I'm not asking for polite, she said. I'm asking for honest. He looked at her again with that complicated expression, and this time she thought understood it a little better. It wasn't hostility. It was the look of a man who had been surprised, and wasn't sure yet if the surprise was good or bad. Then honestly, he said, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? He picked up her suitcase and carried it inside. Someone easier to dismiss, he said, and walked up the stairs. Doss was a lean, weather-beaten man with the kind face that had been outside in all seasons for so long it had become part of the landscape itself, lined and brown and permanent-looking. He shook Elena's hand with both of his and told her the coffee was always on, and the cook stove ran hot on the left side, which she should know before she started anything. Cook, he asked. Well enough. Better than Caleb? I imagine most things are, Doss grinned. It rearranged the whole geography of his face. I think you'll do all right. He was the first person since she arrived who seemed to believe that. It was a small thing, and she wasn't the kind of woman who needed constant reassurance. But small things matter when you're far from everything familiar and standing in a kitchen that isn't yours yet. She spent that first evening going through the kitchen quietly, learning where things were, making a mental inventory. She made a simple supper, nothing elaborate, nothing to impress, and set it on the table at the time Doss had told her they typically ate. Caleb came in from whatever he'd been doing outside, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down without ceremony. He ate without commenting. Elena ate without expecting him to. After a while, he said, You're not what Margaret described. What did she describe? She said you were practical and clear-headed. He refilled his water glass. She didn't say you were, he stopped. Stubborn? Elena offered. I was going to say formidable. She looked at him across the table. He wasn't looking at her when he said it, which somehow made it more genuine than if he had been. She thought, all right, this might work. This might actually work. But she was being too easy on herself. The hard part wasn't going to be Caleb Whitmore. 3 days passed. She learned the rhythms of the ranch. She woke before dawn, not because she had to, but because it was the only time the day felt like her own before it belonged to everything else. She walked the perimeter of the kitchen garden neglected, but not dead, and began planning what she'd need to revive it. She studied the pasture layout from the porch with a cup of coffee in both hands and asked Doss questions in the afternoon while he worked. He answered everything without making her feel like the questions were unwelcome. That was its own kind of generosity. On the 4th morning, she asked to look at the ranch's account ledgers. Doss looked at her with an expression that said he respected the question and wasn't surprised by it. He told her the ledgers were in the desk in the main room and that Caleb hadn't looked at them since January. She spent the better part of 2 days with those books. What she found was not what she expected. The ranch was in worse shape than the fences, and the paintwork suggested not ruined, but pushed close to the edge of something it might not come back from without serious intervention. The cattle operation was losing money at a rate that could be traced back, with some patience, to a series of contracts signed 3 years ago that locked Caleb into selling at prices that made no sense unless you assumed the market was going to move in a direction it didn't. She went back through the contracts and found the name of the cattle buyer on every single one. The name was not one she recognized yet, but it appeared too consistently to be coincidence, and the terms were too poor to be anything but deliberate. She was still sitting with those papers when she heard boots on the porch, and then the front door opened and Caleb came in and stopped when he saw what was spread across the desk. His jaw tightened. "Those are private. Doss told me I could look at them. Doss doesn't own the ranch." Elena did not move, did not shuffle the papers away, did not apologize. "Mr. Whitmore." "Who is Clayton Mercer?" The name hit him like a physical thing. Something went through his expression. She couldn't fully name anger, she thought, but underneath it something more tired. "Where did you see that name?" "On 6 contracts. Over 3 years. Every one of them priced 10 to 15% below what your cattle should have been worth at the time of sale." She looked at him steadily. "The math on these isn't complicated. Someone has been systematically underbuying your stock. If it kept going another 2 years, you'd be finished." Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he walked to the desk and looked at the papers she'd laid out. He didn't look at them the way someone looks at something new. He looked at them the way someone looks at something they've been trying not to see. "I know," he said finally. Elena blinked. "You know. I knew something was wrong. I didn't." He pulled the nearest chair out and sat heavily. "I didn't want to look at it directly, because once I looked at it directly, I'd have to do something about it, and I didn't know what to do." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mercer is Hale's man, has been for years." The name landed. Hale. Victor Hale. The man on the platform with the slow grin and the voice built for public humiliation. "He's been running your cattle contracts through a buyer he controls," Elena said. "That's what I suspect. It's not a suspicion." She turned 2 of the ledger pages toward him. "He's been doing it systematically. Do you know if other ranchers in the area are on the same arrangement?" Caleb looked at her. "You've been here 4 days." "I know. Do you know about the other ranchers?" He was quiet a moment. "The Garfield operation closed last year. Widow Harmon's place sold in the spring for half what it was worth a decade ago. Tom Beckett had to take a loan from the bank to cover a dry season loss that shouldn't have wiped him out." He paused. "The bank Hale sits on the board of." Elena was quiet for a moment, thinking through what that meant, what shape it made. "This isn't just about your ranch," she said. "No," Caleb said. "It's not." She stood, straightened the ledger pages, and stacked them neatly. "All right," she said. "Then we need to talk about what you're going to do about it." He looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted in a way she didn't have words for yet. Something that had been fixed in place for a long time had moved slightly, unexpectedly, in a new direction. "We?" he said. "I'm here," she said simply. "I'm not going anywhere. And I have a better eye for contracts and land records than most people you're going to find in Silver Creek." She paused. "My father was a land attorney in St. Louis for 20 years. I grew up watching him work. I know what fraud looks like in paper." The silence that followed was long. Outside the window, the wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere on the far side of the barn, Doss was working the sound of it, muffled and distant. "Your father," Caleb said. "Is he died?" 2 years ago. She said it flatly, not because she was unaffected, but because she'd learned that flatness was the only way to carry some things and still keep moving. "He left me his books and his notes, and not much else. But I read all of it, multiple times." Another silence. "Different quality. Why did you come here?" Caleb asked. Not the way he might have asked it dismissively 3 days ago. He was asking because he wanted to know. Elena looked at the window, at the dry brown landscape beyond it, at the place she'd traveled 4 days to reach on the basis of a letter from a woman she'd never met, to marry a man who'd expected to find a reason to send her away. "Because I needed to go somewhere that needed me," she said. "I was tired of being in a place where everything I could do was already being done by someone else." He didn't say anything to that, but he didn't look away either. She began building a case the way her father had taught her to build cases, quietly, methodically, starting from what you could prove and working outward. She wrote to 2 of her father's former colleagues in St. Louis careful letters that asked careful questions about territorial land law, water rights documentation, and the legal standing of cattle contracts in Wyoming. She did not explain why she was asking. Her father had taught her that too. Give people only what they need to help you. Doss proved invaluable in ways she hadn't anticipated. He had 30 years of informal knowledge about the land and the water and the families who'd worked it, stored in his memory the way some men store tools, organized not by category, but by use, by when he'd needed them and what for. He told her things about the creek that fed Caleb's main pasture that she wouldn't have found in any written record, things about where the water came from and whose property it crossed, and who had shaken hands on what arrangement 40 years ago, before anyone thought to write any of it down. Hale wants the water. Doss told her one afternoon, without preamble, the way he often said things like he'd been waiting to see if she was ready before he offered them. I know, she said. He doesn't want the land particularly. He's got more land than he can use. But whoever controls the upper creek controls 2/3 of the ranches in this valley. He paused. That's why he wants Caleb out. Elena thought about this. Why hasn't he just bought the water rights? Because Caleb won't sell. Doss looked at her with those careful, weathered eyes. Caleb's stubborn as the land when he sets his jaw about something. It's one of the things that makes him hard to live with, and the only reason he's still standing. She went back to the ledgers that evening, with fresh eyes and a different question. Not just who had damaged the Whitmore ranch, but how Hale had expected it to fall apart. What was the sequence he'd planned? What had he built his plan on assuming? The answer took her the better part of 3 days to find. It was buried in a filing. Caleb hadn't looked at a notice from the Territorial Land Office, 18 months old, sent to the ranch address, and apparently left unopened in the confusion of what had clearly been a very difficult winter. She sat with it for a long time before she brought it to Caleb. He read it twice. His face went very still. I didn't open it, he said. I know, I was last winter, He stopped. Started again. I lost 6 head in 2 weeks to a fever I couldn't identify. The main well froze. Doss threw out his back, and I was working alone for 3 weeks. He set the paper down. I didn't open it. The notice was a competing land claim formally filed, legally structured, citing a disputed boundary survey from 15 years ago that, if accepted by the territorial court, would cut Caleb's land by roughly 1/3, and, not coincidentally, hand the Eastern Creek access entirely to the adjacent property, which was held by a holding company Elena was now sure was owned quietly and indirectly by Victor Hale. The deadline to respond to this was 4 months ago, she said. Caleb looked at the table. That doesn't necessarily mean it's over, she said. There are provisions for filing a delayed response if the notice was not properly received or if there's evidence of procedural irregularity. She heard herself talking and thought, I sound like my father. She didn't know whether to be comforted or frightened by that. But I need the original property deed, the one from your father's purchase, and I need the original survey documentation. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Those are in the county land office in town. Copies, maybe. But originals? He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she recognized now as the look he got when something she said had reached past his defenses and landed somewhere real. My father's desk, he said slowly, in the upstairs room I don't use. A pause. I haven't been in that room in 3 years. Elena waited. I'll get them, he said finally. His voice was different when he said it quieter, heavier, like he was agreeing to something larger than a task. She nodded and didn't push it. There was a version of what she could have said that would have been too much, that acknowledged too clearly what she understood sitting in that room for him. She left it alone. He came down an hour later with a wooden document case, dusty from not being touched. He set it on the table and didn't open it himself. Elena opened it carefully and began to sort through what was inside. The original deed was there. The survey documentation was there. And beneath them, in a hand she didn't recognize at first older, more formal than Caleb's, were a series of notes in the margins of what appeared to be water rights correspondence that made Elena go very still. She read for a long time. Caleb watched her without speaking. Your father knew, she said finally. Knew what? Someone was going to try this. She turned the papers toward him. He made notes. He was tracking something purchases in the valley. Who was buying what and through which holding companies. He built a record. She paused. He just never finished it. Caleb looked at the notes in his father's handwriting. He looked at them for a long time. He died before he could do anything with it, he said. Maybe. Elena looked at the papers, then at Caleb. Or maybe he just didn't know yet what he had. He was building towards something, and he ran out of time. She straightened the papers. We don't have to run out of time. She said we again, and neither of them acknowledged it, but they both heard it. It was a week later that Victor Hale came to the ranch. He arrived in the late morning, unannounced, with 2 of his men behind him at a distance that was meant to suggest casualness, but actually communicated threat. Came to the porch where Elena was repairing the broken seat of the second rocker, the one that had sat unused since she arrived with tools she'd borrowed from Doss. He looked at her work for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Settling in," he said. The smile was the same one from the platform, familiar with itself. "I'm settling in," she said, and kept working. "Good." He put one boot up on the porch step. He was a big man, not tall but wide, built like someone who had spent his whole life taking up space. "I heard you've been going through Caleb's records." Elena looked up from the rocker. She kept her expression pleasant and her voice level. "How did you hear that?" The smile didn't change, but something behind it did. Just slightly. "Small town." "It is," she agreed. "I thought I'd come out, introduce myself properly, since we got off on the wrong foot at the station." He put a hand out. "Victor Hale." She looked at the hand. Then she shook it briefly, firmly, and went back to the repair. "I want to be friendly with you, Miss Voss," he said. "Or Mrs. Whitmore, have you—" "We haven't married yet," she said simply. "Well," he shifted his weight, "however that goes. I want you to know that I'm a man who understands how difficult it is to start somewhere new. And I think you're a smart woman. Smart enough to understand that sometimes the best thing for everyone is a clean and simple arrangement." Elena kept her eyes on the rocker seat. "What kind of arrangement?" "Caleb's ranch has had a hard run," Hale said. His voice was reasonable and measured, the voice of a man who had said this kind of thing many times and knew how to pace it. "The land isn't what it was. The cattle operation has problems that aren't going to fix themselves. I'd be willing to make a fair offer, take the property off his hands, at a price that would let him start somewhere fresh. Somewhere easier." A pause. "And let you start somewhere fresh, too." Elena set down her tools. She stood and she looked at Victor Hale directly, the way she'd looked at him on the platform. "Mr. Hale, Victor," he said easily. "Mr. Hale," she didn't say it unkindly. She said it the way you say something you mean to stay said. "I think you've confused me with someone who came here looking for an easy way out." He studied her. The smile held. "I think you're smart enough to know when a situation isn't going to turn out the way you hoped. Think you're going to be surprised," she said, "by what I hoped for." Behind her, the front door opened. Caleb came out onto the porch. He took in Hale's presence, and his men and his boot on the porch step, and his jaw set in that way Elena had come to recognize, the way he looked when something was confirming what he already suspected about the world. "Victor," he said, "Caleb." Hale's smile, a just slightly less charm, more calculation. "I was just getting acquainted with your—" He gestured at Elena. "Your situation." "My situation," Caleb said, "is my business." "Of course." Hale stepped back from the porch step. "Just being neighborly." He looked at Elena one more time. The look was assessing, not hostile, not warm, the look of a man recalibrating something. "You'll see things more clearly once you've been out here a while, Mrs. Whitmore. The frontier has a way of showing people who they really are." He tipped his hat and walked back to where his men were waiting. Caleb stood at the porch rail and watched until they were down the road and out of sight. Then he looked at Elena. "What did he say?" Caleb asked. "He made an offer," she said. "For the ranch." Caleb was quiet. "I told him no." He looked at her. "You told him." "Someone needed to." She picked up her tools. "Also, I think he knows I've been going through the records. We need to move faster than I planned." She glanced at him. "How much do you trust the county recorder?" Caleb thought about it. "Marginal. Hale has friends in a lot of offices. That's what I was afraid of." She looked at the road where Hale's wagon had disappeared. "Then we're going to need to file certain things before he knows we're filing them, which means we have maybe a week, maybe less, before he moves to cut us off." She turned to Caleb. "Your father's notes mention a woman, a Martha Beckett. Is she related to Tom Beckett?" Caleb blinked. "His mother. She lives outside of town. She's got to be 70 years old. Your father's notes suggest she was present at the original water rights agreement, the one that predates the disputed survey by 8 years." Elena looked at him. "I need to talk to her." Caleb stared at her. "You've been here 2 weeks." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. That might have been disbelief and might have been something else. "When do you want to go?" "Tomorrow morning," she said, "before Hale has time to think about what he saw today and who I might want to talk to next." Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at her with that expression she'd stopped being able to fully read, complicated, layered, something moving in it that wasn't quite what she'd expected from a man who had planned to find a polite way to send her home. "Elena," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She waited. "Thank you," he said, "for not selling the ranch." She held his gaze for a moment. "It's not sold yet," she said, "and it's not going to be." She went back inside to write the letters they'd need ready before morning, and Caleb stood on the porch a while longer, looking at the road, at the land, at the sky above Silver Creek that was turning the pale gold of late afternoon, and thinking, for the first time in a long time, that something might be different now than it had been before. Martha Beckett lived 3 miles east of Silver Creek, in a house that had started out as a 2-room cabin and been added onto over the decades, in the way that frontier buildings often were not by plan but by necessity, each addition slightly out of alignment with the last, the whole thing looking like it had grown rather than been built. The garden was serious. That was the first thing Elena noticed when Caleb pulled the wagon up the narrow track. The garden was the work of someone who needed it to produce, not someone growing flowers for the pleasure of looking at them. An old woman came around the side of the house before they'd even climbed down. She moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned not to waste steps, and she looked at them both with eyes that were sharp and dark and didn't miss much. "Caleb Whitmore," she said. Not a greeting exactly more like identification. "Mrs. Beckett." He climbed down and helped Elena from the wagon. "This is Elena Voss. She's staying at the ranch." Martha Beckett looked at Elena the way you look at something you're deciding whether to trust. It wasn't unfriendly, it was careful. "You're the one from St. Louis," she said. "I am," Elena said. "Margaret wrote me," a pause. "Said you were sensible. I don't always agree with Margaret's assessments, but she has good instincts about people." She turned and walked back toward the house. "Come in if you're coming." The inside of the house smelled like dried herbs and something baking slowly, and the faint mineral smell of old paper. Martha Beckett had shelves everywhere, not decorative shelves, but working ones, crowded with jars and tools and stacks of things that had been organized once and reorganized multiple times since. She pulled chairs out from a table without asking if they wanted to sit and filled cups from a pot on the stove, without asking if they wanted coffee. Elena drank the coffee. It was strong enough to have opinions. "You want to know about the water," Martha said. She sat down across from them and folded her hands on the table. "I want to know what you remember about the original agreement," Elena said, "between your husband's family and the Whitmore family, and whoever else was involved." Martha looked at her steadily. "Who told you I was involved?" Elena pulled out the pages she'd copied from Thomas Whitmore's notes and set them on the table without making a ceremony of it. Martha looked at the handwriting, and something moved across her expression recognition, and something older and more complicated underneath it. "Thomas," she said quietly. "He kept notes," Elena said. "He was building toward something, I think. But he didn't finish it." Martha was quiet for a moment. She picked up one of the pages and read it. She didn't rush. Elena waited. Caleb sat with his hands around his coffee cup and watched his father's handwriting in the hands of an old woman who had known him, and Elena could see something working in him that he was keeping below the surface. "The agreement was made in 1861, Martha said finally. She set the page down. "My husband's father, Thomas Whitmore Sr., and a man named Aldous Greer, who owned the land that later became the Hale property. They agreed that the creek water would run shared through all 3 parcels, equal access, equal maintenance responsibility. Nobody had the right to divert it or charge for it." She looked at Caleb. "Your grandfather's signature is on that document. So is my husband's grandfather's. Where is the document?" Elena asked. "That is the question, isn't it?" Martha stood and went to one of the shelves. She moved 3 jars and a small wooden box before she found what she was looking for, a flat tin, the kind that had once held tobacco, now sealed around the edge with age, and probably with something deliberately applied. She brought it back to the table and set it down. She didn't open it yet. "My husband's father kept it," she said. "After Aldous Greer died and his land passed through several hands, nobody raised the question of the agreement again. There was no reason to. The creek ran the way it always had. People used it the way they always had." She put one finger on the tin. "When Hale started buying up land 7 years ago, my husband got nervous. He was sick, by then he died not long after, but he gave me this and told me to keep it somewhere that wasn't obvious, and not to tell anyone about it unless someone came asking for the right reasons." The silence in the room was careful. "How do you know I'm asking for the right reasons?" Elena said. Martha looked at her for a long moment. "Because you brought Thomas Whitmore's notes," she said. "If you were working for Hale, you'd have come with a lawyer and a different kind of story." She opened the tin. Inside, folded and age-yellowed but intact, was a document. "And because nobody who works for Hale would have thought to ask about this at all. He doesn't know this exists." She looked at Caleb. "Your father suspected it did." He never got far enough to find it. Caleb reached out and touched the edge of the document without unfolding it. His jaw was tight. Elena recognized the expression. Now he got it when something about his father came close enough to touch. "May I?" Elena asked. Martha nodded. Elena unfolded it carefully. Paper was fragile at the creases, but the ink was still legible, dark, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that took itself seriously. She read it through twice, noting the specific language, the parcel descriptions, the signatures, the date. She noted that the water rights described in this document predated by 11 years the survey dispute that Hale's competing claim was built on. If this document was authentic, and looking at it, she believed it didn't just complicate Hale's case. It dismantled it. She looked up at Caleb. He was watching her face. "We need to get this to the Territorial Land Office," she said. "And we need to do it before Hale knows we have it." "He'll find out," Martha said flatly. "He always finds out. The man has ears in places people don't think to cover." "Then we need to move faster than his ears," Elena said. Martha looked at her with something that might in a different woman have been a smile. "You're not what I expected either," she said. "People keep telling me that," Elena said. They drove back toward Silver Creek with the document case between them on the wagon seat, which was not the most sophisticated security arrangement Elena had ever seen, but was what they had. The morning was clear and cold, and the road was empty in both directions, which should have been reassuring, but felt instead like the quiet before something. Caleb drove without speaking for the first 2 miles. Elena led him. "My father tried to find her," he said finally. "I remember him mentioning Beckett once, maybe twice. Thought he was just. I thought he was talking about Tom's family social talk. I didn't know he was following something." "He was methodical about it," Elena said. "His notes are organized like a case file. He just didn't have all the pieces." "He didn't have you," Caleb said, and then seemed to surprise himself by saying it, because he went quiet again immediately after. Elena looked at the road. She felt the weight of the document case against her hip. She thought about her father's study in St. Louis, the smell of it, the particular way late afternoon light came through the window over his desk, and the hours she'd spent in the chair across from him, watching him work reading documents, tracing connections, building arguments from the bottom up, not knowing at the time that she was learning something she would need. She missed him with a sharpness that still caught her off guard sometimes, still arrived without warning in quiet moments. She didn't say any of that. She said, "We need to think about the recording clerk." "You said you didn't fully trust him." "Gerald Fitch," Caleb said. His tone was careful. "He's not corrupt exactly, he bends." "In which direction?" "Whichever one's pushing hardest." Elena thought about this. "Is there a federal land office? Something above the county level?" Caleb glanced at her. "In Laramie, that's 3 days by train." "What about a circuit judge? Someone who comes through who isn't in Hale's pocket." "Judge Arlen Marsh comes through every 6 weeks. He's about as straight as any judge I've seen. He doesn't like Hale personally, which helps. But his next circuit is," Caleb calculated, 5 weeks. 5 weeks. Elena looked at the land rolling past. 5 weeks was enough time for a lot of things to happen that she didn't want to happen. "We file locally," she said, "but we also send copies. To Laramie. Certified through the Postal Service, with a cover letter explaining the situation and the existing claim. That way, even if Fitch bends and doesn't record it properly, there's a record at the federal level that we tried." She paused. "And we get Martha Beckett's signed affidavit about what her husband told her, where the document came from, how it was preserved. That's corroboration." "She'll do that," Caleb said. "She doesn't like Hale either. He tried to buy her property twice, and both times she told him to go somewhere specific." "Good." Elena shifted the document case in her lap. "Who are the other ranchers? The ones who've been hurt the same way you have the Garfields. Tom Beckett, the Harmon widow. Are any of them still around? Still have their records?" "Tom Beckett is around. It was a bad year for him, the loan business. He's not in a fighting mood." Caleb paused. "The Harmon widow moved to Cheyenne when she sold. The Garfield sons still have their father's papers, I think. But there's a lot of bitterness there. They blame me." Elena looked at him. "Why?" "Because when Garfield was going under, he came to me for help. And I didn't." He stopped, adjusted something in his hands. "I was dealing with my own losses that year, and I couldn't." He said it without making excuses of it, which was one of the things she'd noticed about him. He didn't soften his failures or make them picturesque. He just said them straight. "I should have done more. I didn't. Would the Garfield sons listen to you now? If you went to them with what we have?" A long pause. "Maybe if you came with me," she raised an eyebrow. They don't trust me, he said simply. You're new. You don't have any of the history, and you can explain the legal side in a way that would be harder to dismiss. He glanced at her sideways. You talk like someone who knows what they're saying. That's the kindest thing you've said to me since I arrived. Don't make a thing of it. She almost smiled. She didn't quite, but it was close. They reached Silver Creek before noon and went to the county land office first, which smelled like dust and old ink and the particular anxious smell of an underpaid clerk in a complicated situation. Gerald Fitch was a narrow man in his 40s, with the wary eyes of someone who had spent his career trying to anticipate which way trouble was going to come from. He looked at Caleb without pleasure and at Elena without knowing what to make of her. Elena let Caleb do the introduction. She stood slightly back and watched Fitch's hands while Caleb explained what they wanted to file. Fitch's hands were still, which meant he wasn't surprised, which meant he'd been warned. She filed it anyway. She was pleasant and specific, and she kept the filing language simple and precise, and she made sure that Fitch wrote the date and time on the receipt in front of her. Kept her copy. She kept her expression pleasant throughout and her voice level, and she did not give Fitch any reason to think she was watching him particularly, but she was. When they came out, she told Caleb what she'd observed. He stopped on the boardwalk. He was warned. Someone told him to expect us. He wasn't alarmed by what we brought. He was prepared for it. She looked down the street. How fast can Hale have found out about Martha Beckett? Fast, Caleb said. If one of her neighbors mentioned seeing our wagon, then he may already know about the document. If he knew about the document, he'd have come for it before now. Unless he only just found out it exists, Elena calculated. He may not know what we have, but he knows we talked to her, and he'll guess we found something useful. She looked at Caleb. How soon can we get to the Garfield brothers? Their place is 12 miles west. We could go tomorrow. We go today, she said. We go now. Caleb looked at her. She could see him calculating the horses, the time, the light. We'd be coming back in the dark. Then we come back in the dark. He was quiet for a moment. You don't stop, do you? He said. It wasn't a complaint. It was closer to something else she didn't try to name. The window is short, she said simply. He untied the horses. The Garfield brothers were named Emmett and Ray, and they were nothing alike in the way that brothers often aren't. Emmett broad and slow-moving and watchful, Ray quick and angular, with the tight expression of someone running on old grievance. They met Caleb and Elena in the yard without warmth. Ray's jaw was set the moment he saw Caleb, and he kept it set through the entire opening of the conversation, which Caleb handled with a plainness that Elena had learned to read as his version of courage. He didn't explain himself away, didn't ask for grace, said directly that he knew he'd failed their father when it mattered, and that he was sorry for it, and then moved on to why they were there. Ray didn't soften, but he didn't walk away either. Emmett listened. He had his father's financial papers in a crate under his bed, he said, which he'd been meaning to do something with for 2 years without knowing what. Elena went through the papers at the Garfields' kitchen table, while the brothers and Caleb sat around it and watched her work. She found what she was looking for in 40 minutes, the same pattern she'd found in Caleb's records, the same Clayton Mercer as cattle buyer, the same pricing structure, the same slow bleeding of a working ranch through contracts that looked normal until you compared them against market prices of the time. She laid it out for them, simply, without drama. The numbers were dramatic enough on their own. Emmett looked at the papers for a long time. Our father thought he was just unlucky, he said. He wasn't unlucky, Elena said. He was targeted. Ray's jaw was doing something complicated. The grievance was still there, but it was redirecting now, moving off Caleb and looking for a better target. What do you want from us? He said. Your father's records, Elena said, and your signatures on an affidavit. We're building a case for the territorial court, not just for Caleb's ranch, but for every family that Hale has worked this scheme on. The more documentation we have, the harder it becomes to dismiss. Court, Ray said, with the tone of someone who had reasons not to trust courts. Judge Arlen Marsh, Elena said. He's not Hale's. Something shifted in Ray's expression. You know Marsh? I know his record, she said. He reversed a fraudulent land claim in Sweetwater County 3 years ago. He doesn't like land fraud. It's one of a limited number of things that seems to make him genuinely angry. She looked at both brothers. We have a document that predates Hale's competing survey claim by over a decade. We have records showing systematic underpricing of cattle across multiple ranches. If we can get affidavits from every affected family, we don't just have a defense, we have a case. Emmett and Ray looked at each other across the table. Pa would have wanted us to fight it, Emmett said. Ray was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, short and definitive. Tell us what to sign, he said. They drove home in the dark as promised, the horses knowing the road better than the humans in the dark could manage, the document case now considerably heavier, with copies of the Garfield records. Elena was tired in the way she got when she'd been running on concentration for too long, not sleepy exactly, but hollowed out, the body having spent most of what it had. Caleb drove. He'd been quiet since leaving the Garfields, not the closed-off quiet of the early days, but something more thoughtful. You convinced Ray, he said, after a while. I didn't think anyone was going to convince Ray. Ray is angry, Elena said. He's been angry for 2 years with nowhere to put it. I just gave him somewhere to put it. You made it sound simple. Giving people permission to fight is simple. It's everything after that's complicated. Another silence. The night was very dark and very clear, the kind of clear you only get when you're far from city lights, where you can actually see the full quantity of stars rather than just the bright ones. Elena had forgotten that about the sky until she came here. She hadn't looked at the sky properly in years. Can I ask you something, Caleb said. You can ask me anything, she said. I might not answer it. He almost smiled. She caught it in the dark, the slight shift in the line of his profile. What are you actually afraid of in all this? She thought about it seriously, because he was asking seriously. That we get everything right and it still doesn't matter, she said. That Hale has enough money and enough connection that the court finds a way not to see what we put in front of it. That we win the argument and lose the case. Does that happen? More than it should, she said. My father saw it. Cases he built for 2 years airtight, and then the judge. She stopped. Money and connection are their own kind of evidence in some courtrooms. I know that, so why are you doing this? She looked at the sky. Because not doing it is worse, she said. Because I looked at those ledgers and I saw what Hale did to your family and to the Garfields and to the Beckett family and the Harmons. And I thought someone should know. Someone should say it out loud, even if the only result is that it gets said. Caleb drove for a while without speaking. Then he said, My father used to say that the difference between right and wrong wasn't always in the outcome. Sometimes it was just in the standing up. Your father sounds like a man worth knowing, Elena said. He was, Caleb said. He said it the way you say something that's just true, without complication, which Elena had come to understand was his highest register of feeling when something was simple enough to say plain. She looked at the road ahead and felt, under the tiredness, something that surprised her. She felt at home. Not comfortable, the wagon seat was hard, and her back ached, and she still wasn't sure how any of this was going to end but at home. The way you feel when you're in the right place, even if the right place is difficult. She filed that feeling away carefully, because she'd learned not to trust it until she'd had it a while longer. The trouble started 4 days later. She was in the garden, the kitchen garden she'd been rehabilitating in the hours. The other work didn't claim, when Doss came to find her moving faster than she'd seen him move since she arrived. His face had a specific quality she recognized by now as his version of alarm, kept below the surface but visible at the edges. There's a man from the bank in the house, he said. Asked for Caleb. Caleb's in the East Pasture. What bank? Silver Creek Savings and Loan. He said it with the economy of a man who knew what it meant, and was letting her do the same calculation. Hale's bank, she went inside. The man was waiting in the main room. He was young, younger than she expected, with the uncomfortable posture of someone given an unpleasant errand, and not senior enough to have stopped feeling bad about it yet. He introduced himself as Thomas Keene, junior loan officer, and he held a document in both hands that he would clearly have preferred to be holding somewhere else. Elena asked to see the document before Caleb arrived. Keene hesitated. She looked at him pleasantly and held out her hand, and he gave it to her, because she had the kind of steadiness that made giving her what she asked feel like the path of least resistance. She read it. It was a demand for accelerated repayment of an outstanding loan, the loan Caleb had taken 3 years ago to cover the losses from the hard winter. The loan had a 5-year term. It was 16 months from maturity. The bank was citing a clause about property value deterioration that allowed them to call the loan early if the security, the ranch land, was assessed as having declined in value below a certain threshold. Elena read the clause twice. Then she looked at the young banker. When was this property assessment conducted? Keene shifted. The assessment. When was it conducted? She said. Not unkindly, but clearly. Last week, he said, last week. While she and Caleb were at the Garfields. While they'd been building their case. She kept her face very still. By whom? The bank retains an assessor commissioned by the bank, she said, not by an independent party. Keene said nothing, which was its own answer. She set the document down on the desk. How long does Mr. Whitmore have to respond? 30 days, Keene said. He said it like an apology. 30 days. Less time than it would take for Judge Marsh's circuit. Long enough to build pressure, short enough to create panic. Exactly the right length for what it was designed to do. She thanked Keene, and he left with the visible relief of someone who had completed an awful task and could now stop thinking about it. She stood alone in the main room and looked at the demand notice and thought about Hale, about the speed of his response, the precision of it. He hadn't come at them with force or legal threat directly. He'd come at them with money, with the loan instrument, with the pressure point that was hardest to fight because it was technically legal, even if its application was not. He was good at this. She had to acknowledge that. He was very good at this. Caleb came in 20 minutes later, still in his work clothes, reading the set of her shoulders before he even saw her face. What happened, he said. She showed him the notice. He read it. She watched the sequence of what went through him: recognition first, then anger, then something that was starting to look like the old despair she'd seen traces of in those first days. No, she said. He looked up. Don't, she said. Not yet. This is pressure. It's designed to feel like it's over. It isn't. Elena, if they call this loan, they can try, she said. But a loan called on the basis of an assessment commissioned by the same party that stands to benefit from the borrower's default is not a clean legal instrument. There's a conflict of interest built into the assessment itself. She sat down and picked up a pen. I need you to tell me everything about this loan. Every conversation, every document you signed, every interaction with the bank in the last 3 years. Caleb sat down across from her. He looked at her for a moment with something that was complicated and tired and something else she couldn't name from the front of it. All right, he said. They worked through the evening. Doss brought food and left it, and didn't ask questions because he understood the shape of what was happening. The lamp burned low, and Elena refilled it and kept working. Caleb talked, and she wrote, building a timeline of the loan, the conditions under which it had been offered, the representations the bank had made, the fact that Clayton Mercer had been the bank's suggested contact for the cattle contracts that had then proceeded to lose Caleb money that made the loan necessary. The circle was clean. She could see it completely now. Mercer connected to Hale. Hale connected to the bank. The bank's loan created leverage. Mercer's contracts drained the income that would have serviced the loan. The loan then called on the basis of an assessment that the bank controlled. The ranch sold for a price Hale's people would set. She laid it all out on paper and sat back and looked at it. He built a trap, she said. He built it in pieces over years. Each piece looks separate, but they're all connected. Caleb looked at the paper. Can we prove the connection? We can document it, she said. Proving it requires the right judge and the right presentation. But the documentation is there. She looked at him. Question is whether we can get it in front of Judge Marsh before the bank pushes this loan demand to the point where you're forced to sell to stop the bleeding. 5 weeks, Caleb said. We need to accelerate the circuit, she said. Or find another path, she thought. Is there anyone who has Marsh's ear? Any way to communicate what's happening and request an emergency hearing? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his expression. There's a man in Laramie, he said slowly. My father knew him. Elias Pruitt. He's a territorial attorney. He's worked with Marsh before on land cases. A pause. I haven't spoken to him in years. Would he remember you? He knew my father well. He came to his funeral. Caleb looked at the papers. I don't know if he'd take the case. Send him a letter, Elena said. Tonight. Tell him what we have. She picked up 2 of the cleaner pages from the stack. Include copies of the most important documents. Give him something to read, not just something to decide on. Caleb looked at her. You think he'll come? I think if he's the man your father trusted, he'll understand what this is, she said. And I think when he reads what Hale has built here, he'll be angry enough to do something about it. She paused. People who care about the law get angry when it's been used as a weapon. In my experience, that anger is very useful. Caleb was still looking at her in that way. She had started recognizing as the way he looked when she'd said something that had moved through his defenses before he could decide whether to let it in. Write the letter, she said. I'll help you with it. They wrote it together, Caleb's voice, Elena's structure, the particular combination of plainness and precision that she had learned her father's best letters always had. When it was done, she read it back to him, and he made one change, softening nothing, but adding a sentence about his father that was simple and true, and more persuasive for that reason than any argument would have been. Doss took it to town before first light to put it in the outgoing mail before the ordinary morning traffic began. Elena stood on the porch and watched him go and felt the morning cold on her face and thought, "We are running out of time and we have not run out yet, and those two things can both be true at once." She went back inside. There was more to do. The next week was the worst of it, not because anything catastrophic happened, but because nothing resolved either. And there is a particular kind of wearing down that comes from holding a position under pressure without any visible sign that the pressure is going to ease. The lone notice sat on the desk like a stone. No word came from Laramie. The filing at the county land office had been recorded in a form that was technically correct but minimally useful, which told her that Fitch had done exactly what she'd expected bent. Hale did not come to the ranch again. He didn't need to. His instruments were doing the work for him, and he understood she was starting to understand him better now that he was most effective when he was invisible. He let the money and the deadlines and the doubt do the pressure. He understood that uncertainty, sustained long enough, does more damage than confrontation. She saw it doing its work on Caleb. Not obviously he wasn't a man who let things show obviously, but in the way he moved through the evenings, the slight withdrawal that wasn't unfriendly but was removed. He worked hard during the days, harder than before, if anything, like work was the thing he could control when everything else was slipping. Checked on the cattle with a thoroughness that was almost aggressive. He repaired things that didn't need repairing yet. She watched him from a careful distance and didn't push. It was Doss who finally said something in the way Doss said things sideways, without looking at you. They were in the barn, both working on different tasks, and he said without preamble, "He does this. When things get bad, he goes inward where nobody can reach him." A pause. His wife did too, toward the end. That's where the habit comes from. Elena had known about the wife in the abstract, the loss that Margaret had mentioned in her letter, as the reason Caleb had not remarried, the loss that had left the second rocker on the porch unmoved for years. She had not asked about it directly, because it wasn't hers to ask yet. "How did she die?" Elena asked. "Fever," Doss said. 3 winters after they were married. She was carrying their first child. He continued working. He's never said so. But I believe he has always thought that if he had gotten her out of the winter sooner, found a doctor sooner, done something different, she would have lived. He paused. Carries that the way some men carry debt, like it has an interest rate. Elena sat with this. He blames himself. He blames himself for everything he couldn't control, Doss said. That's the core of it. The ranch losing money, the cattle, the loan, he doesn't see them as bad luck or as someone else's doing. He sees them as failure, his failure. Like if he'd been better, sharper, more something, it wouldn't have happened. He looked at her finally. You're the first person since his wife that he's let work alongside him at the thing that matters most to him. You may not have noticed, but I have. Elena set down what she was holding and looked at the barn wall for a moment. She thought about Caleb writing that one added sentence in the letter to Pruitt, the sentence about his father that she hadn't suggested, that he'd added himself. Simple and true. More persuasive for that reason. He's not going to lose this ranch, she said. Doss looked at her and nodded once. He went back to work. That evening she found Caleb on the porch after supper, standing at the rail in the way he did when he was thinking something he wasn't ready to say. Came out and stood next to him, not beside him, the way a pair stands but in the same direction, both looking out at the same dark landscape. I got a response from Pruitt, he said. She waited. He's coming. He'll be here in 10 days. He paused. He said he's seen this pattern before, in 2 other counties. Another pause. He said he'd been waiting for someone to bring him enough to work with. Elena let out a slow breath. It wasn't relief exactly. 10 days was not nothing, and Pruitt's arrival was not a verdict, but it was movement. The first movement in a week that was forward rather than sideways. Good, she said. They stood in silence for a while. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were out the way they were out here seriously, in full numbers, like they meant it. Elena, Caleb said. He said it the way he'd said it on the porch that first week, with a small weight on it, like he'd made a decision about something. She looked at him. I wanted to tell you something. He was looking at the sky, not at her. I wanted to say that I know I made this difficult for you. At the beginning, the way I was. He stopped and started again. I was planning to find a way to send you home, and that was a mistake I'm glad I didn't get to make. Elena looked at him for a moment. He was still looking at the sky. She thought about everything she'd learned to carry over the last years, the loss of her father, the small life in St. Louis that had been adequate and nothing more, the decision to get on a train to Wyoming on the basis of a letter from a stranger, and how none of it had felt like courage at the time, had just felt like moving because staying still was worse. "We're even," she said. "I made a few assumptions about what I was walking into that turned out to be wrong too." He looked at her then. "You're not what I expected either," she said. She let that sit for a moment. "I expected someone easier to understand." Something moved in his face that she didn't try to name. He looked back at the sky. They stood there a while longer, in the cold and the dark, with the document case on the desk inside, and 10 days between them and an attorney from Laramie, and the whole uncertain weight of what was coming. And neither of them said anything more, because sometimes the quiet is its own kind of conversation, and it says the things that aren't ready yet to be said in words. Elias Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect, cold, dry, the kind of Wyoming morning that reminded you it was still technically autumn by insisting on feeling like early winter. Came on the afternoon stage from Laramie, and Caleb met him at the Silver Creek Depot with Elena beside him, which was a decision they hadn't discussed but had both arrived at without needing to. Pruitt was older than Elena had pictured from Caleb's description, somewhere past 60, with white hair and the kind of deliberate movement that came not from age, but from a man who had learned long ago that slowness was its own authority. He wore a good coat and carried a leather satchel that was old and very well cared for, which told her something. He shook Caleb's hand and looked at him with the particular attention of a man taking stock of how the years had changed someone he'd last seen at a funeral. "You look like your father," he said. "People say that," Caleb said. Pruitt turned to Elena. She introduced herself. He shook her hand and held it a beat longer than convention required, studying her face with frank interest. "You're the one who found the Beckett document," he said. "Martha Beckett found it," Elena said. "I just asked the right question." Something in Pruitt's expression settled into something warmer. "Thomas told me once that the best lawyers weren't the ones who knew the most answers. They were the ones who knew which questions to ask." He picked up his satchel. "I'd like to see what you have." They went to the ranch. Elena had the papers organized on the desk when they arrived, not by category, which was how she'd filed them for her own use, but by the sequence in which she planned to present them, which was how you showed someone a case rather than a collection of facts. Pruitt sat down, pulled his reading glasses from his coat pocket, and read without speaking for a very long time. Caleb stood near the window. Elena made coffee, which was not what she wanted to be doing, but was something to do with her hands while she waited. Doss had made him scarce in the way he did when something important was happening that didn't need an audience. When Pruitt finished, he took off his glasses and looked at the desk. Then he looked at Elena. "How long did it take you to build this?" he said. 3 weeks, she said. "Thomas's daughter?" he said, which wasn't quite the question she'd expected. "He was a land attorney. I grew up watching him work." Pruitt nodded slowly. "I see that." He picked up 2 pages, the Beckett water rights document, and the spread of cattle contracts with Mercer's name repeating across them like a signature. "The connection between Mercer and Hale, you can document that directly?" "Not directly," she said, "not yet. But the pattern is consistent enough that it's very difficult to argue coincidence. Mercer's contracts follow Hale's land acquisition timeline. Every ranch that went under or sold below value was working through Mercer. Every one of them bordered Hale's current holdings, or the holdings he subsequently acquired." Pruitt set the pages down. "A pattern is not proof." "No," she said. "But a pattern plus the Beckett document, plus the bank's loan instrument, plus the assessment that the bank commissioned itself, any one of those is weak. Together they make something that a judge with the right disposition is going to find very hard to set aside." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "She's right," he said. "And she knows it isn't enough on its own. That's the part that matters." He folded his hands on the desk. "Tell me about the loan demand." "Every detail." They worked through the evening and into the night. Pruitt asked questions that were careful and specific, and occasionally caught Elena having assumed something she should have sourced, which she noted and corrected without defensiveness, and which seemed to further the attorney's confidence in her rather than diminish it. Caleb answered the questions about his own history, the loan, the conversations with the bank, the contracts he'd signed, and why with the same flat directness he used for everything, neither making himself sound worse than he was, nor better. Around midnight, Pruitt sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I want to pursue two things in parallel, he said. First, I want to request an emergency hearing before Judge Marsh. The grounds will be the fraudulent assessment underlying the loan demand that's the most immediate threat, and it's also the most clearly documented conflict of interest. He picked up the bank papers. An assessment commissioned by a creditor that stands to acquire the secured property in a default scenario is not an independent assessment. Marsh will know that. He won't like it. And the second thing? Elena asked. The second thing is Mercer, Pruitt said. I want to depose him. I want him in a room answering questions under oath about his relationship with Hale and the basis for his pricing of those cattle contracts. He looked at Caleb. That will make Hale move. When he understands that Mercer is being questioned under oath, he will do something, apply pressure, try to get Mercer to disappear, try to interfere with the deposition. And whatever he does will tell us something we don't currently know. Elena understood what he was doing. He wasn't just building a case, he was setting a trap, using the case as the mechanism to make Hale reveal himself. Hale is careful, she said. Careful men make careful mistakes, Pruitt said. He stood and picked up his coat. The careful mistake is usually assuming that the other side isn't as careful as they are. He looked at her directly. He underestimated you from the beginning. That's the error I plan to build on. 3 days after Pruitt's arrival, the fire started. It began in the night, sometime in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the darkness was at its most absolute and the cold had settled into everything. Elena woke to the smell first, before she heard anything, the particular smell of burning wood that was wrong, because there was no reason for fire at that hour. She was out of bed and at the window in seconds. The main barn, not the smaller outbuilding, but the large one, where 12 of the horses were stalled and the winter hay was stored, was burning from the inside out, the fire already through the lower walls, orange light pushing at the cracks in the boards before finding the gaps and surging upward. She was down the stairs and out the door shouting, before she'd fully processed that she was barefoot on frozen ground. Caleb came out of the house behind her. He'd heard it, or smelled it, or some instinct that comes from a lifetime of knowing every sound a property makes had pulled him awake. And when he saw the barn, his face did something she had never seen it do. It went completely blank, the way a face goes when the thing it's seeing is too large to process in real time. Then he ran. Doss was already there, the barn door open, leading horses out by their halters in the organized, urgent way of a man who had rehearsed this terrible situation enough times in his mind to know how to move through it. Elena ran to help him. The horses were panicking, some moving out obediently in their terror, because Doss was steady and known to them, others fighting the lead, whites showing around their eyes, the smoke thickening fast. She grabbed a halter and pulled, talking low and constantly the way her father had once told her horses needed not calm words, just consistent sound, and the horse came. They got 11 of the 12 out. The 12th, a bay mare named Cora that Caleb had owned for 9 years, went down inside before anyone could reach her, and the section of roof above her collapsed 20 seconds later, and that was the end of it. They stood in the yard in the cold, the rescued horses bunched and trembling at the far fence, and watched the barn burn. Caleb stood slightly ahead of the others, and Elena watched his back, the set of it, the particular stillness of a man who is holding something by the thinnest thread available. There was nothing to do about the barn. The well water wouldn't have reached it in time, and there wasn't enough of it, so they stood and watched it go. When it had burned down to what it was going to be, Caleb turned and walked to the fence and stood with the horses for a while. Elena followed, not saying anything. He had his hand on the neck of the closest horse, and his face was toward the animal, and she couldn't see his expression. After a long time, he said, "This wasn't an accident." "No," she said. "He did this because of Pruitt." "Yes," she said. "Or because of the deposition. Pruitt sent notice to Mercer yesterday." Caleb's hand moved slightly on the horse's neck. "So now he's burning me out." "He's trying to," she said. "That's different." He looked at her over his shoulder. In the gray pre-dawn light, with the smoke still rising behind them, he looked like a man who had been pushed to a specific edge and was deciding what he was going to do there. "It's not different enough," he said, "Caleb." She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, with a small weight on it, deliberate. "I know what this looks like right now. I know what it feels like. But this is what he does when he's scared. He burns things. That means we're close enough to matter." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something worked in him, she could see it working. The old despair trying to take hold, and something else pushing back against it. and she wasn't sure which one was going to win. "I lost Cora," he said. It was a small thing to say in the middle of everything else, and it was exactly the right thing, the real thing, the thing under all the legal and strategic weight of the situation, a horse he'd owned for 9 years, dead in a fire someone had set on his property. "I know," she said. He turned back to the fence, and they stood there until the light started coming up, gray and gradual, over the land that was still his. Pruitt came out from town when he heard. He walked through the remains of the barn without speaking, his face set in the expression of a man cataloging something carefully, and then he went back to the house and sat down and wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When he came out, he had an amended filing for the emergency hearing that now included the fire as evidence of intimidation and interference with a pending legal proceeding. "If we can establish that Hale ordered this," he said, "the legal situation changes significantly. This is no longer a land dispute. This is criminal interference." "Can we establish it?" Elena asked. "Can you find anyone who saw something?" The nearest neighbor was the Beckett farm. Elena drove there herself that morning and found Martha in the garden and asked her directly if she'd seen or heard anything in the night. Martha had not, but she mentioned, in the practical way she mentioned things, that her older dog had been agitated around 2 in the morning, barking toward the road, the way he barked at riders passing, and then settling when whatever had passed had gone. "Riders," Elena said, "not a wagon." "He distinguishes," Martha said. 3 or 4, I'd say, by the noise of him. He was worked up enough that it was more than one." Elena went back to town and found the livery stable owner, a man named Garvey, who knew every horse in the county and their riders and their habits the way a librarian knows books. She asked him to think about who might have had horses out the night before, who might have ridden east toward the Whitmore ranch in the small hours and back again. Garvey thought about it with the slow thoroughness of a man who took the question seriously. After a while, he said there were 2 horses he hadn't seen yesterday that he'd expected to, belonging to men who worked for Hale's operation and generally brought them in for water on days they were riding. He gave her the names. She brought the names to Pruitt. Pruitt looked at them and then looked at her. "You did that in 4 hours," he said. "I asked the right questions," she said, which was what she always said, which was true and also insufficient as a description of what it actually cost her to ask them. The deposition of Clayton Mercer took place in the back room of the Silver Creek courthouse, which smelled like old wood and nervous people, and had a table that wasn't quite level and chairs that creaked in different registers when you moved. Pruitt had requested a court recorder, which the circuit court system provided in the form of a young woman named Ada, who wrote shorthand faster than anyone Elena had ever watched, and who made no expression whatsoever at anything anyone said, which Elena found deeply impressive. Mercer was a compact, watchful man in his 50s, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent a long career in rooms where what you said could be used against you. He came with his own attorney, a man named Shields from Casper, who had the expensive, controlled look of someone Hale was paying for directly. Shields objected to the first 4 questions on procedural grounds that were technically sound and operationally designed, purely to waste time and establish presence. Pruitt let the objection sit and then proceeded exactly as he'd been proceeding, which was the right response, not ignoring Shields but not being thrown by him either. Elena sat in the corner of the room, which was where Pruitt had put her, because he wanted her to be able to watch Mercer's face during questioning without Mercer watching her back. She had a notebook. She wrote things in it. Not transcription, Ada was doing that, but observations. The moment in Mercer's expression when Pruitt read out the list of ranches he'd contracted with. The slight compression around his mouth when the Whitmore name came up. The particular stillness too deliberate to be natural when Pruitt asked him to describe his relationship with Victor Hale. "Mr. Hale is a client," Mercer said, "as are many ranchers in this county." "In what capacity?" Pruitt said. "Cattle brokerage," Mercer said. "I broker sales." "You broker sales at prices you determine?" "At market prices," Mercer said. "The market prices you determined for the Whitmore Ranch's cattle in 19,880 were." Pruitt read the numbers from the ledger copies, each one with the corresponding market price Elena had found in the Wyoming territorial livestock records she'd requested from Laramie. "Does that pricing accord with your recollection of the market at that time?" Mercer looked at the numbers. His attorney touched his arm. Mercer said he'd need to review his records. "Of course," Pruitt said, and handed him the copies of his own records, which Elena had identified in the original Whitmore files and which matched the numbers in the ledger precisely. Shields leaned over and spoke quietly to Mercer. Mercer's expression when he looked up was carefully neutral in the way that careful neutrality always costs something to maintain. The market varied, Mercer said, by 15% consistently below the territorial average, across 6 contracts over 3 years. For every ranch in this valley that subsequently defaulted or sold below assessed value to parties connected to Victor Hale, Pruitt said. Not a question, Shields objected. Pruitt noted the objection for the record and continued. Elena wrote in her notebook, "He knows we have it. He knew before he walked in," which meant Hale knew, which meant every question Pruitt asked from this point forward was being filtered through Hale's preparation, through whatever story Mercer had been given to tell and told to hold to. She looked at Mercer's hands and thought about what he was more afraid of, the court, or the man who had sent him here with a story. After the deposition, Pruitt sat with her and Caleb in the ranch's main room and told them what he thought they had. Pattern documentation was solid. The conflict of interest in the bank's assessment was solid. The water rights document was solid. The witnesses Martha Beckett, the Garfield brothers, potentially Tom Beckett if he could be persuaded, were solid. What they did not have was a direct documented link between Hale and the fire. 2 men Garvey identified, Elena said, the ones with the horses. Circumstantial, Pruitt said. They work for Hale. That doesn't prove he ordered them. What if one of them talked? Caleb said. Pruitt looked at him. Is there a reason one of them might talk? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The younger one, Avery Dodd. He's been with Hale 2 years. Before that, he worked for the Garfields. He was a decent hand. Before he stopped. He needed the work when the Garfield operation went under. He took what was available. Elena looked at Caleb. You know him? I knew him well enough. He was a good kid. A pause. I don't know what working for Hale 2 years does to a good kid. Elena put her notebook down. Let me talk to him. Both men looked at her. Not here, she said, not officially. Just a conversation. The way you have a conversation with someone you're not trying to corner. She looked at Caleb. You said he was a good kid? Good kids who do something they shouldn't usually know they did something they shouldn't. Knowledge is uncomfortable. If someone gives them a way to put it down, sometimes they take it. Caleb considered this. He'll be defensive. Yes, she said. He might tell Hale you came to him. He might, she said. But Hale already knows where we are. He knows what we're doing. The deposition tells him that. She paused. The question is whether Avery Dodd is the kind of man who can live with what he did to that barn. The silence that followed was Caleb deciding something. She could see him deciding it. I'll tell you where he boards, he said. She found Avery Dodd the next morning at the Silver Creek boarding house, where he rented a room, sitting on the front steps eating breakfast, because the dining room was too small for all the boarders, and he'd lost the seat lottery. He was 23 or 24, with the kind of face that hadn't finished becoming what it was going to be young enough, that everything showed clearly, not yet practiced at hiding things. He looked up when Elena came and recognized her. She could see it, and his expression did the thing expressions do when you're caught between wanting to look innocent and knowing it's too late for that to work. She sat down on the step beside him without being invited. Not close enough to crowd him. Just present. I'm not going to ask you about the fire, she said. He looked at his food. I'm going to tell you something instead, she said. What Hale has done in this valley to the Garfields, to the Becketts, to the Harmon family, to Caleb Whitmore, there's a case being built for the territorial court. A real one with a territorial attorney and a judge who doesn't bend. She kept her voice level, and even, whatever happens with the fire, that's its own question. What I want you to understand is that what Hale built here is coming down. Not because of anger. Because of paperwork. Because there are 30 years of records that show exactly what he did and how he did it. Avery Dodd looked at his plate. Something in the line of his shoulders was doing complicated work. You worked for the Garfields before you worked for Hale, she said. Emmett and Ray Garfield's father. Did you like him? A long pause. He was all right, Avery said quietly. He was a fair man. He lost his ranch, she said, because Hale worked the same scheme on him that he worked on Caleb. The same cattle buyer, the same prices, the same bank. She let that sit. Mr. Garfield died thinking he'd failed his sons. He hadn't. He'd been robbed. Avery's jaw worked. He didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to do anything today, Elena said. I'm asking you to think about something. Think about who you're protecting by staying quiet and whether they deserve it. She stood. If you decide you have something to say, Elias Pruitt is the territorial attorney on the case. He'll handle it properly. She walked back down the street and didn't look back, told Pruitt and Caleb what she'd said. Pruitt listened and was quiet for a moment, and then said it was either exactly the right thing or would produce no result at all, and that was the nature of that kind of conversation. Caleb said, "You told him Hale is coming down." "I believe that's true," she said. "And if it isn't?" She looked at him. "Then I told him the truth as I understand it, and it wasn't enough. That's a risk I'll live with." They had 6 days before the emergency hearing. In those 6 days, the work was a different kind, not building but shoring up, making sure everything that was going to be presented was in its best possible form, that the documentation was clean and the sequence was clear, and the witnesses knew what they were being asked to say and what they were not being asked to speculate about. Martha Beckett came to the ranch to review her affidavit with Pruitt, and she sat at the table and read it line by line with the focused deliberateness of someone who was not going to put her name on anything she didn't mean precisely. She made 2 corrections, both of them slight but both of them important, and she signed it in a hand that was steady and clear. The Garfield brothers signed theirs without changes. Ray had stopped looking at Caleb like he was the target of something. He was redirecting, as Elena had known he would, toward the right target. Tom Beckett was the uncertain one. He came to the ranch 3 days before the hearing alone, in the early evening, and sat in the main room looking at the papers. Elena laid out with the expression of a man who had been through enough that more evidence of his misfortune was not welcome in any direction. "That loan," he said. "I signed those contracts. Nobody held a gun to me. Nobody needed to," Elena said. "That's how it works. You sign a contract that looks like a contract. You take a loan that looks like a loan. You don't find out what it actually was until it's too late." She paused. "Tom, your father's land. How long had that been in your family?" Beckett looked at the table. "My grandfather built the house," he said. "And the loan Hale's bank offered you when you needed it. What were the terms?" He told her. She listened, and she kept her face still, because the terms were worse than she'd known, more punishing than what Caleb had been given, which told her that Hale had read Tom Beckett correctly as a man less likely to fight back. "You weren't careless," she said. "You were targeted. There's a difference, and you deserve to have that difference stated in a court of law where it will be recorded." Beckett looked at the papers for a long time. The room was quiet. Doss had gone to bed. Caleb was outside, giving them the space this conversation needed. "My wife doesn't know the extent of it," Beckett said. "Really happened." "She doesn't have to know more than she already knows," Elena said. "The affidavit addresses the facts, that's all." He signed it that evening. He shook her hand before he left and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of statement. The night before the emergency hearing, Pruitt sat with Elena and went through the sequence one final time. They had done this already, twice, but Pruitt was the kind of attorney who reviewed things a final time not because he didn't trust himself, but because he trusted the value of doing it one more time over trusting his memory of having done it before. Caleb sat with them for the first part of it and then moved to the porch. Elena noticed him go. She finished the review with Pruitt, noted 2 things she wanted to revisit in the morning, and then went outside. He was at the railing. The night was what it always was out here, serious, dark, full of stars. She'd stopped taking the sky for granted since she arrived, which was one of the things Silver Creek had given her that she hadn't expected to want. "You should sleep," she said. "Probably," he said. She stood next to him. They'd developed a habit, in the evenings, of standing in approximately the same direction and not requiring conversation of each other, which was a kind of ease she hadn't had with many people in her life. "I keep thinking about the barn," he said after a while. "What about it?" "I keep thinking that he did it because he was scared of what we were building, and I keep being—" He stopped. "Keep being angry about it in the wrong way. Like the anger is about Cora and the hay and the wood, and not about what it is, which is that he burned my property because he thought it would break me." "Did it?" she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "Then be angry about that," she said. "The other anger is fine too. That's the one that matters." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what I've been thinking about? Besides all of this." He gestured vaguely toward the house and what it contained and what it represented. "I've been thinking about the day you arrived. At the station." He paused. "I was standing at the end of the platform, and I watched you get off the train, and I watched Hale do what he did, and I thought, I don't know what I thought exactly. I thought she's going to turn around, or she's going to cry, or something is going to happen that I can understand. And instead," Elena said. "And instead you picked up your suitcase and walked past him," Caleb said. like he was furniture. A pause. I didn't know what to do with that. Neither did I, she said honestly. I was terrified. I just couldn't show him that. Caleb looked at her. I know, he said. That's the part I think about. The night settled around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and was silent. The horses shifted in the temporary shelter Doss had built to replace what the barn had been, until the barn could be rebuilt, until whatever was coming tomorrow was over, and they could think about what came next. Elena, Caleb said. She waited. Whatever happens tomorrow? He stopped and reconsidered something, visibly, in the way she'd come to recognize as him editing himself toward the thing he actually meant rather than the easier version of it. I need you to know that this ranch, what it is now, what it feels like to be here now, that's different because of you. Whatever happens in that courtroom. He looked at the darkness. You didn't save this place. We're not done yet. We don't know if we're going to save it. But you changed what it is. And I needed you to know I know that. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the word home and how it wasn't a place exactly, but a quality of presence, the feeling of being somewhere that needed exactly what you had to give and where what you needed could actually be found. She'd been looking for that since her father died, maybe before that, and she had not expected to find it in Silver Creek, Wyoming, on a failing ranch, in the middle of someone else's fight that had become her fight without her quite deciding when that happened. It's a good ranch, she said. It deserves to survive. He almost said something else. She could see it forming, and then reforming into something smaller, something held back for a later time, a different night. He nodded. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow matters. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer. Through the window, by the lamp she left burning, she could see the papers on the desk. 30 years of Hale's patient, careful, methodical theft, documented and ordered and ready to be set in front of a judge who Pruitt believed would not look away from it. She was afraid. She had been afraid for weeks. She had learned, watching her father work, that fear and readiness are not opposites, that you can be both at once, that the fear is often just the readiness taking a shape you recognize. She went to bed. She slept badly, which was honest. She woke before dawn, which was what she'd needed to do, and she was at the desk and working in the pre-light dark when she heard Caleb come downstairs and go to the kitchen and start the coffee without being asked, the way someone does it when they've started to think of a place as their own. It was Doss who came to the house at noon the following day, 2 hours before they were due at the courthouse, with a look on his face that stopped Elena mid-sentence. There's a man out front, he said. Says his name is Avery Dodd. Says he needs to talk to the attorney. Pruitt looked up from the papers. Caleb looked up from his chair. Elena set down her pen. Send him in, Pruitt said. Avery Dodd came in looking like someone who had not slept in several days, which he probably hadn't. He was younger looking in daylight than he'd been on the boarding house step, and he moved with the careful physical control of someone who had made a decision that he knew couldn't be unmade. He sat in the chair Pruitt offered. He looked at Elena. You said to come to you if I had something to say, he said. I did, she said. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at Pruitt. I was there, he said. The night of the fire. There were 3 of us. Hale's foreman, a man named Craw, he told us it was Hale's order. Told us Whitmore's barn. Make sure nobody was hurt, just the structure. His jaw moved. He told us it was just property. The room was very still. Just property, he said again. And the way he said it was the sound of a man who had been telling himself that for a week and had finally run out of the ability to make it feel true. Pruitt reached for a fresh sheet of paper. Mr. Dodd, he said, in the careful, unhurried voice he used when something important was about to be written down. I want you to tell me everything, from the beginning, in your own words. Take as long as you need. Avery Dodd took a breath, and he began. Elena wrote nothing in her notebook. She just listened to the quiet sound of the thing they'd needed, arriving in the room 2 hours before it was needed, in the form of a young man who had decided that what he'd done to a barn and a horse and a man's winter security was not something he could keep living with in silence. Outside, the morning was moving toward noon. The courthouse was 2 miles away. The judge was coming on the afternoon circuit. Elias Pruitt was writing in his careful hand, and Caleb Whitmore was sitting very still in the way he sat when something had surprised him by going the right direction. And Elena Voss was looking at the window and thinking about her father, the way he'd said once that the law was a slow machine and an imperfect one, and you had to feed it the right material and trust it to do the work, and that patience was not the same thing as passivity. Feed it the right material. They had the right material now. The Silver Creek Courthouse was not a large building. It had been constructed with the practical ambitions of a town that expected to grow but hadn't fully yet 2 courtrooms, a clerk's anteroom, a judge's chamber that was really just an office with a better chair. The main courtroom held perhaps 60 people if they didn't mind being close to one another, and on the afternoon that Judge Arlen Marsh called the emergency hearing to order, there were more than 60 people in it. Elena had not expected that. She had not thought about who might come, had been so focused on the materials and the sequence, and Avery Dodd's statement written out and signed and witnessed that morning, in the 2 hours before they'd driven to town, that the question of audience hadn't occurred to her until she walked through the courthouse door and found the room already crowded with faces she partially recognized from the weeks she'd been in Silver Creek. The Garfield brothers were there. Martha Beckett was there, which surprised Elena because the drive from her farm was not easy, and Martha had not mentioned coming. Tom Beckett was in the back row next to his wife, who held his hand in a way that said she knew more than Tom had told Elena she knew. There were ranchers Elena didn't know by name, but recognized by type weathered, careful, the particular posture of people who had come, because what happened in this room was going to matter to their lives, regardless of whether their names appeared on any document. And Victor Hale was there. He sat on the far side of the room with 2 men Elena recognized as his attorneys, not Shields from Casper. 2 different men, better dressed, which told her something about how seriously he'd taken the last few days. He looked at Elena when she came in with the flat, measuring look of someone who had been recalculating and was not finished. He did not look at Avery Dodd, which was its own kind of statement. Avery Dodd sat in the second row behind the plaintiff's table, slightly apart from the other people around him. He had the quality of a man who was very cold and couldn't do anything about it not cold in temperature. That particular interior cold that comes from having done something you can't walk back from and not knowing yet whether it was the right thing. Judge Arlen Marsh came in, and the room stood and sat, and Marsh settled into his chair and looked at the courtroom over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things in courtrooms and was prepared to see more. He was 60-something, lean and angular, with the deliberate patience of someone who had made a career of not being rushed. "I'll note for the record," Marsh said, "that this is an emergency hearing requested by plaintiff on grounds of irreparable harm pending resolution of underlying land and contract claims." He looked at both tables. "I've reviewed the filings. Mr. Pruitt, you may proceed." Pruitt presented the case the way Elena had watched him prepare it in sequence, building from foundation to structure. Each piece placed before the next was introduced. He was not a theatrical attorney. He didn't perform. He explained clearly and specifically, and let the material carry its own weight. He began with the water rights document. Marsh examined it for a long time, asking questions about provenance and chain of custody that Pruitt answered precisely. Martha Beckett was called to the stand, and she testified about her husband's preservation of the document, about the original agreement, about the water rights that predated Hale's competing survey claim by over a decade. She answered every question in the same tone she used for everything direct, unhurried, unbothered by the attorneys on the other side, who tried several approaches to shake her account and found none of them working. Hale's lead attorney, a man named Forsyth, objected on grounds of relevance 3 times. Marsh sustained 1 objection, overruled 2, and told Forsyth that he would be given appropriate time to address the document standing when it was his turn. Then Pruitt laid out the cattle contracts. He presented them in chronological order, alongside the territorial livestock market records, and he read the numbers into the court record, without commentary, just the numbers, the dates, the name of the buyer, and the corresponding market price at the time of each transaction. The gap between what Mercer had paid and what the cattle were worth did not require explanation. It was the kind of mathematics that explained itself. Elena sat at the table and watched the room while Pruitt worked. She watched the ranchers in the gallery, watched the moment when the accumulated numbers landed not just for the Whitmore Ranch, but for the Garfield operation, for the Beckett family, for the Harmon widow whose records the Garfields had preserved, watched the understanding move through the room, the way understanding moves through people who have been wondering for years why things went wrong, who had blamed the weather or the market or themselves, and were now hearing a different answer. Hale's expression throughout was controlled. He leaned occasionally toward Forsyth and said something quiet. He looked at the papers. Pruitt presented with the careful attention of a man looking for the flaw he could use. Elena had been watching him for long enough to read the edges of what he was feeling, and what she read was not panic. Hale was not a man who panicked, but a recalibration happening in real time. A realization that what was in front of him was larger and better organized than he'd expected it to be. He had underestimated them. She had known he would. She had also known that knowing it in advance didn't mean they'd won. Avery Dodd was called to the stand in the late afternoon, when the room had been sitting in close company for several hours and the light through the courthouse windows had shifted to the low, flat gold of late afternoon. He walked to the stand with the walk of someone who had decided to do something hard and was going to do it all the way through. He was sworn in. Pruitt asked him to state his name and his employment. He did. Pruitt asked him where he was on the night of October 14th. Avery Dodd looked at the middle distance for a moment, not at Hale, not at Caleb, somewhere between them, and then he told the court where he was. He described the instruction he'd received from Hale's foreman. He described the 3 riders, the route they'd taken, the barn. He described what they'd done and in what order, and he described Craw telling them it was Hale's specific order, and he described riding back to the Hale property in the early morning and being told not to discuss it. He said all of it plainly, without embellishment, the way someone says something they have rehearsed, not for performance, but because they needed to say it clearly and couldn't trust themselves to find the right words in the moment. His voice was steady. It cracked once, when he described the sound the barn made when the roof went, and he stopped for a moment and then continued. The room was very quiet. Forsyth's cross-examination was aggressive and specific, aimed at Dodd's credibility, his employment by Hale, his potential motive for testimony, the absence of other witnesses to Craw's specific instruction. Dodd answered what he could answer, and said plainly when he couldn't answer something that he didn't know, which was the right thing to do, and which Forsyth kept trying to make look evasive, and which didn't quite succeed. When Forsyth sat down, Pruitt asked one follow-up question. "Mr. Dodd," he said, "you currently still work for Victor Hale?" "Quit this morning," Dodd said. Why Dodd was quiet for a moment? Because it wasn't just property, he said. The room absorbed that. Marsh asked no questions. He looked at the witness stand for a moment with the expression of a man who had heard testimony in many forms and knew when someone was telling the truth, not because truth had a particular sound, but because lying after long enough exposure has one. Forsyth's presentation began the following morning. He was a skilled attorney, and he worked with what he had, which was legitimate in its technical dimensions, questions about the age and authentication of the Beckett document, arguments about the proper interpretation of the competing survey claim, procedural challenges to the deposition materials. He presented a land assessor who testified to the current valuation of the Whitmore property in language that was careful and supported by numbers that Elena noted were internally consistent and externally questionable if you knew what comparable properties were trading for. She passed a note to Pruitt during the assessor's testimony. He read it without changing his expression and incorporated it into his cross-examination, which dismantled the assessor's comparative methodology in 4 questions that were short and clear and left the witness without a clean answer to any of them. Hale did not testify. Forsyth kept him off the stand, which was the correct tactical decision. Hale on the stand would have been Pruitt asking him about Mercer, about the foreman's specific instruction on the night of the fire, and Forsyth was not going to let that happen in a room where the answers were recorded. But the absence of Hale's testimony was its own presence. The room noticed it. The ranchers in the gallery noticed it. Marsh noticed it. Elena was sure, in the way a judge notices what isn't said alongside what is. The closing arguments took most of the afternoon. Pruitt was measured and specific, returning to the Beckett document and the cattle records as the twin anchors of the case, the water rights fraud and the financial fraud, both systematic, both documentable, both pointing in the same direction. He addressed the fire as what it was, not a random misfortune, but a deliberate act taken to interfere with a legal proceeding that Hale had understood was coming for him. He did not overstate. He did not use words like criminal conspiracy or fraud in his closing, unless they were already in the record. He let the facts make the argument, and he trusted Marsh to understand what the facts said. Forsyth's closing was long and technical, and hinged on the principle that each element of the plaintiff's case, taken separately, was insufficient, that the pattern Elena had documented was inference, not proof, that Dodd's testimony was the account of a single man with reasons to curry favor, that the Beckett document, however genuine it appeared, had not been subject to proper forensic authentication. It was not a bad argument. In a different courtroom, before a different judge, parts of it might have worked. Marsh thanked both parties and recessed for deliberation. They waited in the anteroom outside Caleb and Elena and Pruitt and Doss, who had driven them in and refused to wait outside. The Garfield brothers waited in the corridor. Martha Beckett sat in a chair against the wall and appeared to be doing something with her hands that was either praying or mending. It was hard to tell, and Elena didn't ask. The wait was an hour and 40 minutes, which was long enough to exhaust conversation, and short enough to be surprising when Marsh's clerk came out and said the judge was ready. Caleb stood first. He looked at Elena, and she looked back at him, and there was a whole conversation in that exchange that neither of them needed to say out loud, "We did what we could." It was the right thing. Whatever happens. Now we did the right thing, and then they went back into the courtroom. Marsh came in, the room stood, the room sat. He read for several minutes from his notes before he spoke aloud, which meant he had written something substantial, which meant he had formed a considered opinion, which was either very good or the kind of very bad that came with full explanation. When he began, his voice had the specific quality of a man who intended every word to be on the record and knew it. The competing survey claim, filed against the Whitmore property, Marsh said, relies on a boundary interpretation that postdates by 11 years a water rights agreement, whose validity this court finds adequately established by the documentary evidence and witness testimony presented. The competing claim cannot override the prior agreement. It is dismissed. Elena felt Caleb go very still beside her. Regarding the loan demand issued by Silver Creek Savings and Loan, Marsh continued, the court finds that an assessment commissioned by the creditor institution, conducted in the absence of independent verification, and timed to coincide with the initiation of legal proceedings against a party connected to the creditor's board membership, constitutes a procedurally compromised instrument. The demand is suspended pending an independent assessment. The 30-day repayment deadline is voided. She heard someone in the gallery exhale. She thought it might have been Tom Beckett. Regarding the matter of the fire at the Whitmore property, Marsh said, and the room went very still in a different way. The testimony of Avery Dodd establishes under oath that the fire was set by parties acting under instruction attributed to Victor Hale by the foreman directing the action. This court is not the venue for criminal proceedings, and I will not render a criminal finding here. However, I am referring the matter, with the full transcript of these proceedings, to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for investigation. In the interim, I am issuing an injunction against any further action by Victor Hale, his employees, or his financial instruments against any party who provided testimony in these proceedings. The room was not quiet anymore. It was making the sound a room makes when a great deal of pressure releases at not cheering, not quite, more like the collective sound of people breathing again after a long time of not doing it quite right. Hale stood. He stood before Forsyth could stop him, and for one moment he looked across the courtroom at Elena with an expression that was not what she expected, not rage, not the calculated cold she'd seen from him before. It was the expression of a man who had built something over decades and had just watched someone else take it apart piece by piece, and the thing in his face was something closer to recognition than anything else. Like he understood now exactly what had happened to him, and by whom. Then Forsyth had his arm and was speaking to him quietly, and Hale looked away. Outside the courthouse, the light was the low gold of nearly evening, longer and flatter and colder than it had been when they went in. Pruitt shook hands with Caleb, which Caleb returned with both of his, which from Caleb was the equivalent of an embrace. Martha Beckett allowed herself a small, private smile in the way she allowed herself most things briefly and without making a show of it. Ray Garfield said, "So it's done? The land case is done," Pruitt said. "Criminal referral is beginning." "Those are different timelines." "Hale won't go quietly," Emmett Garfield said. "No," Pruitt agreed. "But going loudly takes money and it draws attention. And he's just had a great deal of attention drawn to him in a format that will be publicly available." He picked up his satchel. Loud is not his preference. He'll try to manage what he can manage and minimize what he can't. Elena stood slightly apart from the group, which was not a conscious choice, but was where she ended up when she stopped moving for a moment. She was tired in a way that went all the way through, not the hollow tiredness of having spent concentration, but something more fundamental, the tiredness of sustained tension that had finally let go. Caleb found her there. He came and stood beside her the way he did in the evenings, in the same direction, looking out at the main street of Silver Creek in the early dark. "It's not over," she said. "The criminal," he said. "Pruitt told me. Months, maybe longer," he paused. "I know it's not over. But the ranch is safe," she said. "The water rights. The loan. The ranch is safe," he said. He said it like he was still hearing it for the first time, like the words hadn't quite reached the place in him that needed to hear them. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, at the people moving past in the evening, at the town that had watched her get off the train 2 months ago and had made its assessments. Several of those people glanced at Caleb and Elena as they passed, and the glances were different from what they'd been at the beginning, not suspicious, not dismissive, something more complex. The look people have when they've been forced to revise an opinion they held with some confidence. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "You're allowed to be glad," she said. "You don't have to qualify it yet." Something shifted in his expression, the complicated architecture of it relaxing slightly, just slightly. The way a fist opens when the reason for holding it closed is gone. He wasn't a man who smiled easily, which meant when he did it meant something. And what was on his face in that moment was not quite a smile, but was its near neighbor. "I'm glad," he said. She nodded. "Good." Doss appeared at Caleb's shoulder, coat on, holding the wagon reins. "If we're going home," he said, "we should go before the temperature decides to make a point." Caleb looked at Elena. "Ready?" She picked up her bag from where she'd set it on the courthouse step. She looked at the building one more time, the plain, practical front of it, the light still burning inside, where the clerk was processing the day's records, the words that had been said in there that were now permanent, that would exist in the county record and the territorial archive, and eventually in the files of the Attorney General's office, where Hale's name would sit attached to questions that weren't going to go away. "Ready," she said. They drove home in the early dark, the three of them on the wagon seat, Doss with the reins, the cold air coming down from the north, with the smell of coming weather in it. Caleb sat close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, not touching but close, the particular proximity of two people who had stopped maintaining careful distance without discussing that they'd stopped. She thought about what home was again, what it had been before, what it was now. Thought about the desk inside, with the papers that still needed organizing, the kitchen garden coming back in the cold, the second rocker on the porch that she'd fixed, and that she sat in some mornings with her coffee, before anyone else was awake. She thought about the things Caleb hadn't said yet, on the porch and in the courtroom, and in all the evenings in between. The things she could feel taking shape in him, the way something takes shape slowly in cold weather unhurried, deliberate, becoming itself at the pace it needed to. She was not in a hurry. She was for the first time in a long time, somewhere that had room enough for things to develop at their own pace. The ranch came up on the left in the dark, the house windows lit by the lamp she'd left burning, the temporary shelter Doss had built standing where the barn had been, the fence lines running out into the darkness in both directions. It was not beautiful in the way that things in stories are beautiful. It was a working place that had been damaged and was recovering, that had been almost lost and wasn't, that carried the marks of everything that had happened to it the way all real places do. Caleb looked at it as they came up the track. He looked at it the way you look at something you came close to losing. Then he climbed down from the wagon and held his hand up for Elena, which he did now without thinking about it. And she took it without thinking about it, and they went inside, where it was warm. Winter came to Silver Creek the way it always came, without announcement, without apology, simply arriving one morning as a fact the land had already accepted before anyone living on it had caught up. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days, and the creek that fed the eastern pasture developed a skin of ice at its edges that thickened overnight. And Doss moved through his morning routines with the particular efficiency of a man who had done winter preparations for 40 years and had learned to respect the season enough not to underestimate its intentions. The barn was not rebuilt yet. It would take most the next winter to rebuild properly. The lumber had been ordered and was coming by wagon from Casper. The foundation work had been done in the last dry weeks of autumn by Caleb and Doss and 2 hired hands who had come for the week and left with pay that Caleb had managed from what remained of the fall cattle sale. The first one in 3 years, where the buyer had not been Clayton Mercer. The difference in price per head had been enough to make Caleb stand at the kitchen table, reading the sale figures for a long time, without saying anything. Elena had not asked what he was thinking. She had made coffee and set a cup next to him and waited. After a while, he had looked up and said quietly, "This is what it should have been, all along." Yes, she had said, that was all either of them needed to say about it. The cattle were in the temporary shelter through the cold months, closer to the house than usual, their breath making small clouds in the frozen air each morning when Elena went to check on them. She had learned more about cattle in 3 months than she had known in her previous 28 years, which was not difficult since she had known essentially nothing, but she had approached the learning the way she approached most things, which was to treat ignorance as a solvable problem rather than a permanent condition. Doss had taught her without making a production of it, in the practical sideways manner of someone who respected competence and could see when it was developing. She was not good with the cattle yet. She was competent, which was different, and she knew the difference. Competent meant she could do the necessary things without causing harm. Good would take longer, and she had the patience for it. The Attorney General's investigation into Victor Hale began formally in December, 2 months after Marsh's ruling. Pruitt wrote from Laramie with the details 2 investigators had been assigned. They had already interviewed Mercer. And Craw, the foreman who had directed the barn fire, had been taken into custody on an arson charge in November. Craw had predictably attempted to minimize Hale's involvement, and predictably, Pruitt wrote, the investigators were not persuaded by the minimization. Hale himself had hired a team of attorneys from Denver, and was not, by all accounts, inclined to cooperate with anything. He remained in Silver Creek through the early winter, which surprised Elena until she thought about it more carefully, and then it didn't surprise her. Men like Hale didn't run. Running was an admission. He would stay, and he would fight, and he would spend whatever it took to make the process as long and expensive and exhausting as possible, because that was the tool he had always used, the belief that the other side would eventually run out of money or will or both. He did not know Elena Voss particularly well, even now. She wrote to Pruitt in December with 3 additional documents she'd found, bank correspondence she'd located in the county recorder's archive, letters between the bank's board and a holding company that she was now able to connect through a chain of 4 intermediate entities to Hale's primary land acquisition vehicle. The chain was not simple and would require explanation, but it was documentable, and it was the kind of financial architecture that investigators with subpoena power could unravel in ways she could not. Pruitt wrote back, this is exactly what they needed. Where did you find bank correspondence in the county recorder's archive? She wrote back, I asked the right questions. Christmas came to the ranch without ceremony, which was exactly how Elena preferred it. She had never been a woman who needed occasions to be large. She made a good dinner, not elaborate, but made with care, with the dried herbs from the kitchen garden she'd rebuilt through the autumn and the stores she'd put up in the weeks before first frost. Doss ate 2 portions of everything without commenting on it, which from Doss was extravagant praise. Caleb had given her something that morning, set on the kitchen table before she came downstairs, a small wooden box, the kind used for correspondence, with a fitted lid and a simple latch. It was handmade, which she knew because she could see the care in the joinery, the particular patience of the work. She had looked at him when she opened it. I made it in October, he said, with the directness he used when he was being honest about something he'd done. The evenings when you were working on the bank records, I needed something to do with my hands. She looked at the box. She thought about him in the evenings in October. In the other room, while she worked at the desk, the small sounds of tools, which she had registered without identifying, thinking it was repair work, Doss's domain. She thought about what it meant that he had been making something for her in the evenings while she worked, quietly, without mentioning it. Caleb, she said, it's not. He stopped and reconsidered. I know it's not much. It's the best thing anyone has made me, she said. She meant it simply, without reaching for more than that. He looked at her the way he looked at her, sometimes when she said something that got past the part of him that was always slightly braced. He didn't say anything, which from him was also saying something. She put her father's letters in it that afternoon, the ones she carried everywhere, the ones from his last years that she'd read so many times the folds had gone soft. Put them in the box and set it on the table beside her bed, and it fit there the way things fit when they belong where they are. Margaret came in January. She arrived the way she'd arranged everything in this story, with a practical letter that described her plans and assumed they were acceptable. Elena had not minded the assumption. She had written back to say she was welcome. Caleb's sister was nothing like Elena had built from the letters and the second-hand description. She was younger than Elena had pictured, early 30s, with Caleb's coloring and none of his containment. She expressed everything clearly and immediately, and moved through a room the way weather moves, not dramatically but thoroughly. She embraced her brother in the yard when the wagon stopped, and he returned the embrace with a stiffness that was clearly habitual and clearly comfortable. The stiffness of siblings who love each other in a language they've been speaking so long. They've stopped noticing its particular vocabulary. Then Margaret turned to Elena and held out her hand, which Elena shook, and Margaret looked at her for a long moment with the serious assessment of someone who had written a letter to a stranger and handed her brother's life to the answer. "You stayed," Margaret said. "I said I would," Elena said. "Most people who say they will don't," Margaret said. She looked at the house, at the yard, at the temporary shelter where the barn had been, at the kitchen garden visible around the side of the house in its winter dormancy. "Show me what you've done here." Elena showed her. Margaret asked questions that were specific and interested, and occasionally pointed about the financial recovery, about the water rights situation, about the investigation in Laramie, about how the cattle looked, and what the spring calving situation was expected to be. Elena answered all of them, in the same way she answered Pruitt's questions directly, with the uncertainties named as uncertainties rather than papered over. When they came back inside, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and looked at her brother with an expression that was complex and private and contained several years of worry reaching a conclusion. "You're all right," she said to him. "I told you I would be," he said. "You told me a lot of things," she said. "You also told me you didn't need anyone." Caleb picked up his coffee cup. "I was wrong about that," he said, and looked at Elena with the plain, uncomplicated look of someone who has said the true thing and doesn't feel the need to say more. Margaret looked between them and said nothing. But she allowed herself the small, private smile of a woman who placed a letter in the mail 2 years ago on the basis of instinct and had turned out to be right. She stayed 6 weeks. She was not easy company exactly. She had opinions, and she expressed them, and she was wrong sometimes and right more often than was comfortable, but she was genuine, which Elena valued more than easy. She helped with the winter work without being asked. She was useful with the cattle in a way that suggested she'd done it before, which turned out to be true. She'd worked her husband's ranch in Nebraska for 8 years before he died, which was something she mentioned once and didn't make a story of. She and Elena developed the careful, honest friendship of two women who respect each other more than they have reason to after short acquaintance, and who are smart enough to know that respect is a better foundation than warmth, which can be manufactured, and usually is. The night before Margaret left, they sat at the kitchen table after Caleb and Doss had gone to bed, with the lamp between them and the winter wind, working at the windows the way it did in January, persistent and purposeful. "He was very bad the years after Catherine," Margaret said. She said it the way she said things she'd decided to say directly, without building up to it. Catherine was the name Elena had learned for the wife, the woman who had died in the third winter, who had been carrying his child. He didn't stop functioning. He kept the ranch, he did what needed to be done. But something went very quiet in him. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," Elena said. "It's not as quiet now," Margaret said. She looked at the table. "I can't tell you it's the same as before, because I don't know if it's the same. I think it's different. I think he's different. But something is alive in him that wasn't when I came last year." She looked up. "That's you." Elena held her coffee cup. She thought about the evenings on the porch, the conversation about being afraid, the letter they'd written together to Pruitt, the box made from October evenings. She thought about what it was to stand beside someone through something difficult, without standing in front of them, without taking it from them, without pretending it wasn't as hard as it was. "We helped each other," Elena said. "I know," Margaret said. "But you came from somewhere else. You had somewhere else you could have gone. You chose this." She paused. "He knows that." "I know he knows," Elena said. Margaret nodded. She finished her coffee. She looked at the box on the shelf, the correspondence box, which Elena had moved to the kitchen because she used it daily now for the ongoing paperwork of the investigation and the ranch. "He made that," Margaret said. "It wasn't a question." "In October," Elena said. Margaret looked at it a moment longer. "He made things when he was a boy," she said. "He stopped after Catherine. I didn't know he'd started again." She said it quietly, the way you say something that costs a small amount to say. She left the following morning with the practicality she brought to everything, climbing into the hired wagon before the frost had lifted, and waving once from the road without sentimentality. Elena stood on the porch and watched her go, and felt both lighter and strangely empty, the way you feel since someone who has filled a space for a while takes the shape of themselves out of the room. Caleb came out and stood beside her. "She likes you," he said. "She doesn't like most people." "I like her," Elena said. "She doesn't pretend." "No," he said, "she never has." The investigation into Hale concluded formally in March, 14 months after Marsh's emergency ruling. The Territorial Attorney General filed charges that covered arson, fraudulent land claims, and financial fraud, a suite of charges that Hale's Denver attorneys fought across 3 separate preliminary hearings before accepting a negotiated resolution that included the dissolution of the holding company that had operated the fraudulent land acquisition scheme, financial restitution to the affected families, and Hale's removal from the board of Silver Creek Savings and Loan. Hale did not go to prison. Elena had expected this possibility and had prepared herself for it, which did not mean it didn't matter, but meant she had thought clearly about what justice could look like versus what it sometimes did look like, and had decided in advance that the resolution, if it came in this shape, was still worth what they'd done to get it. The Garfield brothers received restitution for their father's losses. Tom Beckett's loan was restructured under terms that the new bank board no longer containing Hale or his people deemed appropriate. The Harmon widow, now in Cheyenne, received a formal letter and a settlement payment that her lawyer acknowledged, and that, Elena heard through Martha Beckett, had made the old woman sit down and cry in her sister's kitchen. Martha Beckett herself received nothing formally. She had not been financially damaged in ways the restitution covered, but she wrote Elena a letter in April that was 3 sentences long and said, "The creek is running the way it should. My husband would have been glad to know about it. I think your father would have been glad too." Elena read the letter twice and put it in the box with her father's letters. Spring came the way spring comes after a hard winter, not gently. Not with permission, but insistently, the land pushing back against the cold in the way it always had and always would, whether anyone was paying attention or not. The kitchen garden came back with the particular stubbornness of things that know how to wait. The creek ran full through the eastern pasture, running the way it should, the way the 1,861 agreement had said it would, the way it might not have if the documents in the tin had never been found, and Martha Beckett's husband had not kept them, and Martha Beckett had not kept her husband's trust. The new barn went up in April. It took 3 weeks and the help of 7 men from neighboring ranches who came with their tools and their time because Caleb asked, and also because there is a specific accounting that communities keep, and Silver Creek knew what had happened in the winter that had just passed, and people who understood what had nearly been lost wanted to be part of what was being built. Elena cooked for all of them for 3 weeks. It was the hardest physical labor she had done since arriving, the sheer volume of it. The logistics of feeding 10 people 3 times a day while also doing everything else, and she did it imperfectly. Burned 2 batches of biscuits in the first week, and ran short on flour on the 4th day, and had to send one of the younger hands into town for more. She didn't apologize for the burned biscuits. She threw them away and started again, which was the only reasonable response to burned biscuits, and which seemed to be the response the men found appropriate. Ray Garfield worked on the barn for all 3 weeks. He was a good carpenter, better than he looked, which was a pattern with Ray, and he and Caleb worked alongside each other without speaking much, in the practical quiet of men doing shared physical work. And Elena watched from the side sometimes, and thought about how some things that are broken don't get repaired through conversation, but through the slow accumulation of time spent in the same direction, which is its own kind of repair, and sometimes a more durable one. On the last day, when the barn was finished and the last of the lumber had been cleared and the tools put away, Caleb stood looking at it for a long time. It was not the same as the old barn, it was newer, the wood lighter. The construction slightly different in the way that rebuilt things are always slightly different from what they replaced. But it was solid and it was his and it was there. Doss stood beside him. "Better drainage than the old one," Doss said, which from Doss was high praise. "It is," Caleb said. Elena came to stand on the other side. They looked at it together, the 3 of them, and no one said anything that needed saying, because the barn said itself, standing there in the late afternoon light of an April day on land that was paid for and documented, and no longer in danger of being taken. Question Caleb had been working toward all winter, all spring, came on a warm evening in May. She had known it was coming the way you know approaching weather, not the exact moment, but the shape of it, the quality of the air before it arrives. She had watched him building toward it for months, in the way he built toward things slowly, honestly, making sure of the ground before he put weight on it. They were on the porch. The evening was the kind of May evening that almost justifies every Wyoming winter warm and long lit, the sky keeping its blue well past the hour it should, the smell of the land after a day of sun, and the creek running in the distance. He had been quiet for a while in the way that was not empty. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at the railing, then at the yard, then at her. "You came here on someone else's letter. Because of my sister. Because of a situation that was never properly explained to you." He paused, and she could see him doing what he did, reducing what he wanted to say to what he actually meant. "I want to ask you if you'd stay. Not because of the ranch. Not because of the case. Not because you don't have somewhere else to go. I know you have somewhere else." He held her gaze. "'Cause you want to." Elena looked at him. She thought about the train from St. Louis, the smell of coal and travel, the $11 and the worn suitcase, and the decision made on the basis of a letter from a woman she'd never met. She thought about the platform, and Victor Hale's voice, and picking up her suitcase and walking past him. She thought about the ledgers spread on the desk, and the document in Martha Beckett's tin, and the letters written in the cold early mornings, and the fire in the night, and the courtroom, and the lamp burning, and the box made from October evenings. She thought about her father saying, "The best lawyers know which questions to ask." She thought about this question. She thought about how it was the exact right question, not asking her to stay for him, not asking her to stay out of circumstance, asking her if she wanted to, acknowledging that she had a choice, that the choice was real, that he understood that about her. "Yes," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes, you want to," he said, not uncertain, verifying, making sure he had understood correctly. "Yes," she said again, "I want to." He nodded once. He looked at the yard again. Then he said, "I should have asked you months ago." "You weren't ready months ago," she said. "That's true," he said, without defending himself. "Neither was I, exactly," she said. "I knew what I wanted earlier than you did, but knowing what you want and being ready for it are different things." He looked at her with an expression she had learned, over months, to read clearly. The expression that meant something had gotten through. Something he'd braced for and hadn't needed to brace for. "When did you know?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "The night I told you the loan notice wasn't over," she said. "You started to go somewhere to that place you go, and I said no, and I meant it with everything I had. And then I understood that the reason I meant it wasn't just the ranch." She paused. "It was you. I didn't want to watch you go to that place." He was quiet for a while. The evening settled around them, the light going the slow amber of late spring. "I think I knew before that," he said, "at the Garfields. When you talked to Ray. I watched you give him somewhere to put 2 years of anger, and I thought," he stopped and started differently. "I thought, this woman understands something about people that most people never figure out." "What's that?" she said. "That anger isn't the problem," he said. "Only the problem when it has nowhere to go." She looked at him for a moment. "That's one of the smarter things you've said. Don't make a thing of it," he said. She almost laughed. She didn't quite. But it was very close, and he saw it. And something in his face settled into the ease that appeared there sometimes now, the ease that had been absent for years and was returning slowly, unevenly, at its own pace, not restored to what it was before, but becoming what it was going to be, which was different, and real, and perhaps more durable for having been rebuilt from scratch rather than simply repaired. They married in June, in the Silver Creek courthouse with Pruitt as witness because he happened to be in town on other business, and Martha Beckett and Doss and the Garfield brothers because they came without being specifically asked, which was exactly the right thing. Margaret came from Nebraska on 3 days' notice, which from Margaret was essentially instantaneous. The ceremony was short and without ceremony, in the way both of them preferred things. Caleb because he had always distrusted the gap between the size of an occasion and the weight of what it was actually about. Elena because she had learned early that the real things in life were usually quiet. Afterward, they ate at the table in the ranch house, which was too small for all of them, but not by much. And Doss burned the bread rolls he'd been trusted with and didn't apologize. And Ray Garfield and Caleb had a disagreement about cattle pricing that went on for 20 minutes and resolved in a draw. And Martha Beckett told Margaret a story about her husband that was funny and true, and that made Margaret laugh in the way she rarely did fully, without calculation. And Elena sat in the middle of all of it and felt, without sentimentality but with great clarity, that this was the life she had come here to find. There is something that happens to people who survive the kind of sustained fight that Elena and Caleb survived, not the grand dramatic version of it, Not the version that sounds like adventure from a distance, but the real version, the grinding daily version of holding on, when holding on is all you can do and you're not sure it's going to be enough. What happens is, you learn something about yourself that you couldn't have learned any other way. You learn what you're actually made of, which is almost never what you thought. Elena had thought, before Silver Creek, that she was her father's daughter, competent, organized, good with documents and logic, and the particular architecture of legal argument. She was all of those things. But she learned in that first terrible week when the loan notice appeared, and the filing went sideways, and the barn burned, and everything they'd built seemed to be crumbling at once. She learned that she was also something her father had been but had never named for her, because some qualities don't get named until they're tested. She was someone who did not break under pressure, not because she was hard, but because she understood, somewhere beneath the fear, that pressure was only another form of information, telling you where the real work was. Caleb learned something different. He had believed, for 3 years, that he had failed the ranch, Catherine, his father's name, everything he was supposed to protect. He had carried that belief like a weight he deserved. What he learned slowly, over months of being seen clearly by someone who had no reason to see him generously and did anyway, was that the failure he'd been carrying was real but not the whole story. That loss is not the same as failure. That grief is not a character flaw. That the ranch declining in the years after Catherine died was not evidence that he was inadequate, but evidence that one person, alone, with a broken heart, can only do so much, and that what he'd managed was actually considerable. Couldn't have told you when that understanding arrived. It didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces in evenings on the porch, in the moment he watched Elena tell the court the story of his father's notes. In the morning, he found her in the kitchen before dawn, making coffee, and realized that the house sounded different than it had for years. That the difference was her moving through it like it was hers. Because it was the thing people don't tell you about being saved, about having someone come into your life and change the direction of it, is that it doesn't feel like being saved from the inside. From the inside, it feels like working very hard alongside someone who is also working very hard, and slowly realizing that the working together is itself the thing, not a means to something else. The result is not a rescue. The result is a life. By summer, the ranch was running better than it had in 5 years. Cattle numbers were back to 300 head and climbing. The new barn was seasoned in, and the horses had taken to it. Kitchen produced more than they could use through the summer, and Elena spent August putting things up with a thoroughness that Doss called excessive, and that she recognized as her response to the memory of the first winter, the need to. Make sure, the need to have enough set aside, the instinct to prepare for the hard season while the good one was still present. She wrote to her father's former colleagues in St. Louis twice that summer. One of them, a man named Aldrich, who had taken over her father's cases after his death, wrote back to ask if she'd considered returning to the city, that there might be a position for someone with her particular combination of skills at a firm that was handling territorial land litigation. She wrote back a letter that took her 3 drafts, because she kept starting it the wrong way before she found the right opening, which was simply, "I'm exactly where I need to be." She sent it without showing it to Caleb, not because it was private from him, but because it didn't need to be discussed. It was just true, and truth at that level didn't require consultation. He found out about it later, from Doss, who had taken the letter to town and who mentioned it in the way Doss mentioned things sideways, in passing, to see what Caleb would do with it. What Caleb did with it was stand quietly for a moment, and then go back to what he was doing, which was also true and also didn't need to be discussed. Victor Hale left Silver Creek in September, which Elena heard from Martha Beckett, who heard it from Tom Beckett, who had it from the new bank manager. He sold his holdings through an intermediary and went east, destination unknown. He didn't announce it. He didn't make a statement. He simply was there and then was not. The way things end when they end without ceremony, and Silver Creek continued in his absence with the ordinary business of being a place where people were trying to make lives in difficult conditions and mostly managing to. The name disappeared from conversation within a few months, not because people forgot, but because the present's more pressing than the past, which is how most places survive what happens to them. Martha Beckett told Elena about Hale's departure on a Tuesday afternoon in October, sitting at Martha's kitchen table with the same strong coffee, in the same careful chairs. Elena received the information and sat with it for a moment. "How do you feel about that?" Martha asked, which was unusual for her. She didn't generally ask about feelings. Elena thought about it honestly. I feel like it's the right ending, she said. Not satisfying exactly, but right. Satisfying would have been prison, Martha said. Yes, Elena said. It would have been. Martha poured more coffee. Your father would have found a way to get that too, she said. Elena looked at the old woman. How do you know about my father? Caleb told me, Martha said. When you were working on the affidavit, he said you'd learned everything from watching your father work, and that your father had been the best kind of attorney, which was one who understood that the law is a tool, and tools are only as good as the hands holding them. She sipped her coffee. He said it like he was proud of you. Elena set down her cup. She thought about Caleb saying that to Martha Beckett, volunteering it, unprompted. The quiet pride of it, and the feeling that came was something she didn't have a clean word for, something warm and complicated and absolutely real. She thought about her father's letters in the box on the kitchen shelf. She thought about what it meant to carry someone with you, not the grief of them, not the absence, but the living part, the part that taught you something and kept teaching you long after they were gone. He was, she said. He was the best kind. The second rocker on the porch had sat in the same place since Elena fixed it in that first week, the week before she knew what she was walking into, before she understood that she had found, without looking for it, exactly the thing she needed. She sat in it most mornings now, in the early hour before the day became the day, with coffee and whatever quiet the morning offered. Caleb came out sometimes and sat in the other one. They didn't always talk. The mornings were often better without talking. But one morning in November, the first hard frost of the second winter, he came out with his coffee and sat beside her and looked at the frozen land, the pastures going brown and silver, the creek catching light at its edges, and said, My father used to sit out here. I know, she said. Doss told me. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at the land that had been his father's and was his and would be whatever came next. I think he would have liked you, he said. I hope so, she said. I liked his notes. He almost smiled. That's a strange thing to say. It's true, she said. His notes were the notes of someone who paid attention, who understood that the small details are where the real story lives. She paused. It's the most important thing my father ever taught me. Pay attention to the details. They'll tell you everything if you let them. Caleb looked at the land. What do the details tell you now, he said. She looked at the frost on the pasture, the barn solid against the morning sky, the horses visible through the shelter walls, the kitchen garden dormant under its first thin ice. That we made it through the first year, she said. That's all? She thought about it. That the creek is running the way it should, she said. That the ground we're sitting on is ours. That the people we fought for are better off than they were. She paused. And that the hardest thing isn't the fighting. The hardest thing is staying open to something after you've been through enough to make closing feel safe. He was quiet for a while. You stayed open, he said finally. Not a question. I tried to, she said. Not always successfully. But I tried. So did I, he said, eventually. She looked at him in the cold morning light. He was looking at the land, the way he often was, not avoiding her gaze, but seeing both things at once, the present and the longer past behind it, the way people look at places they are deeply attached to. He had the face of a man who had been through something and had come out the other side changed, but not diminished, marked by it, which was different from broken by it. She thought about the word courage, not the large version of it, the dramatic kind, the ordinary kind, the kind that looks like just showing up again the day after things went wrong, the kind that looks like opening a letter from a stranger and deciding to answer it, the kind that looks like standing on a train platform in a strange town with $11 and a worn suitcase and not turning around, the kind that looks like a man making a box from October evenings because he needed something to do with his hands, and he wanted to give her something that was made. Courage, she had learned, was almost never the grand gesture. It was the small, steady thing. The decision to keep going made again each morning. The willingness to want something again after wanting something had cost you everything. The ability to let someone see you clearly and not flinch from what they saw. Caleb Whitmore had that kind of courage. Underneath everything she had known it when she saw him on the platform, separate from the others, with his complicated expression and his hands in his pockets and his plan to find a polite way to send her home. She had known it before she could name it, which was often how knowing worked. And if she had learned anything from Silver Creek, from the ledgers and the fire and the courtroom and the winter and the box and the two rockers on the porch, if she had learned one thing that she would carry forward into every year that came after, it was this: that the life worth having is almost never the life that was easy to find. It's the one that required you, that needed what you specifically had to give, that met you at your exact level of difficult and asked you to stay. She had been asked to stay. She had stayed. The frost caught the light in the east pasture and turned it briefly, brilliantly, into something that looked nothing like what it was, cold and hard and plain in the daylight, but in that particular angle, in that specific moment, catching the sun and holding it. Then the angle shifted and it was frost again, just frost, doing its ordinary work in the ordinary world. Elena drank her coffee. Beside her, Caleb did the same. The ranch went about its morning. The day became what days become when you're in the right place, something that holds you without asking you to be less than what you are. That was enough. It was, in fact, everything.